It's quiet. The night is here, and you're in the right place. This video brings you long ghost stories and haunted encounters designed to relax your mind and soothe you into sleep. If you enjoy the stories, like, subscribe, and share where you're listening from. Make yourself comfortable, and let's begin. Story 1. The mirror in our hallway shows someone who isn't in the house. It was the first thing we saw when we signed the papers for the old Victorian on Sycamore Street. Not the peeling gingerbread trim or the sagging porch, but the mirror. It hung in the narrow front hallway, directly opposite the front door. A tall, ornate thing in a tarnished silver frame, its glass wavy and clouded with age. Original to the house, the realtor chirped, oblivious to the way my wife Lena's smile tightened. Such character! Lena hated it immediately, said it gave her the creeps. I called it practical. It was the only mirror in the entryway, but it wasn't practical. It was a window, and something on the other side was watching. The first time I noticed it was subtle. I was alone, dropping my keys into the bowl beneath it after work. In the glass, my reflection moved just a fraction too slow, like a lagging video feed. I blinked, shook my head. Tired. New house jitters. But later that night, Lena whispered in the dark, "Did you see it too? In the mirror? When I was putting on my shoes this morning, there was someone behind me for just a second, a woman in a dark dress." I dismissed it. Stress, a trick of the warped glass, until I saw her myself. It was a Tuesday. Rain lashed the windows. I was alone, sorting mail in the quiet hallway. I glanced up at the mirror as I passed. My reflection was there, yes, but behind my shoulder, in the space where the empty hallway should have been, stood a woman. She was tall, gaunt, dressed in a high-collared black dress that looked decades out of date. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with deep-set eyes that held a sadness so profound it made my chest ache. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring down the hall towards the kitchen, her expression one of desperate longing. I spun around, heart hammering. Nothing, just the empty hallway, the sound of rain, the smell of damp wool from my coat. I turned back to the mirror. She was gone. Only my own wide-eyed face stared back, pale and shaken. Lena started avoiding the hallway. She'd take the long way around through the dining room to get to the kitchen. "It's not right," she'd mutter, wrapping her arms around herself. "She's always looking for something or someone." I tried logic. Research. The house was built in 1890, owned by the Ainsley family for generations. Records were spotty, but I found a faded newspaper clipping from 1923. Eleanor Ainsley, 38, lost to influenza. Leaves husband and infant son. The photo showed a young woman with dark hair and those same deep, sorrowful eyes. Eleanor. The name settled in my bones like cold stone. The mirror's rules became clear. It only showed her when you were alone, never when two people stood together before it, and she never looked at the viewer. Always down the hall towards the back of the house, the direction of the nursery, the old nursery, now our storage room. The sight of her became a physical weight. Coming home from work, my hand would hover over the doorknob, dreading that glance into the glass. Sometimes she'd be there, standing silently in the reflection's hallway, wringing her hands. Other times she'd be crouched near the floorboards, as if searching for something small. Once I saw her gently touch the reflection of the door to the storage room, her fingers tracing the wood grain with heartbreaking tenderness. The air around the mirror would turn icy cold when she appeared, and a faint scent, like old roses and dust, would hang in the air long after she vanished. Lena couldn't take it anymore. "We have to cover it," she insisted one evening, her voice brittle. "Or take it down. It's not healthy. She's not ours." I agreed, though part of me felt a strange protectiveness towards Eleanor's silent vigil. That night, after Lena went to bed, I stood before the mirror alone. The glass was fogged, as if breathed upon. In the condensation, words appeared, written in a shaky lupin hand. "He won't let me see him." My breath caught. Him, the infant son, Thomas, who'd grown up, inherited the house, died childless decades ago. Who was Eleanor waiting for now? I found a heavy quilt Lena had chosen. As I unfolded it, the hallway temperature plummeted. My breath plumed white. The mirror's surface rippled like dark water. Eleanor appeared. Not in the hallway reflection this time. She was in the glass, standing right behind my reflection, so close her cold breath seemed to kiss the back of my neck. Her eyes, wide and impossibly sad, met mine through the mirror, not looking past me, looking at me. For the first time, her lips moved, forming silent words. "Please." The quilt slipped from my numb fingers. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her hand, pale and translucent, pressed against the inside of the glass. It left a perfect frost-rhymed handprint that didn't fade when she vanished seconds later, leaving only the icy handprint and the scent of grave soil. We covered the mirror the next day, heavy blackout cloth nailed tightly over the frame. The house felt lighter, warmer. Lena slept through the night for the first time in weeks. I almost believed it was over until a dream started. Vivid, suffocating dreams of standing in a darkened nursery, moonlight through a grimy window, a crib, and the sound of a baby crying, a thin, weak wail that cut through the silence, and always just outside the nursery door in the dream hallway, a woman's muffled sobs. Eleanor's sobs. I'd wake gasping, the sound of that crying echoing in my ears, the smell of old roses thick in the bedroom air. Lena never heard it, only me. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. Lena was away visiting her mother. The house felt unnaturally silent, oppressive. I was making tea in the kitchen when I heard it, faint at first, a soft, rhythmic thumping, like a small fist against wood, coming from the hallway, from behind the covered mirror. I crept out, my mug forgotten. The cloth over the mirror was bulging inward, straining against the nails. Thump, 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 a child's fist, and beneath it, Eleanor's voice, raw with tears, whispering through the cloth. "Thomas, Mama's here. Please, open the door." The nails holding the cloth began to pop out one by one, showering the floor with plaster dust. The cloth billowed like a sail catching wind. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The thumping grew frantic. Thump, thump, thump. The final nail tore free. The cloth fell away. The mirror wasn't reflecting the hallway. It showed a small, dimly lit room, a nursery. Moonlight streamed through a dusty window, illuminating a simple wooden crib. And standing beside it, her back to the glass, was Eleanor. She was gently rocking the crib, humming a lullaby I'd never heard, but somehow knew in my marrow. In the crib, a tiny bundle stirred. A weak cry escaped, a real, living sound that echoed through the glass into my silent hallway. Eleanor turned slightly, her face illuminated by the moonlight. Not sad now, radiant, peaceful. She looked directly at me through the glass, her eyes filled with a love so fierce it stole my breath. She placed a finger to her lips. Shh. Then she gestured subtly towards the nursery door, a door that in the mirror world stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to me, wide with sudden, desperate fear. He's coming. A shadow filled the doorway in the mirror, tall, imposing, silhouetted against the hall light. Not Thomas, grown old. Something else. Something that radiated cold malice. Eleanor grabbed the edge of the crib, pulling it back, shielding the baby with her body. The shadow man stepped into the nursery. He didn't have a face, just a deeper darkness where one should be. He reached a long, shadowed hand towards the crib. Eleanor let out a silent scream, throwing herself over her child. I acted without thought. I grabbed the heavy brass candlestick from the hall table and swung it with all my strength at the mirror. Glass exploded outwards in a deadly rain of shards. The image of the nursery, Eleanor's terrified face, the shadow hand reaching for the crib, all vanished in a spiderweb of fractures. The cold vanished. The scent of roses faded. Silence crashed down, thick with the smell of dust and broken glass. I sank to my knees in the debris, shaken, cuts stinging on my arms from the flying shards. The hallway was just a hallway again. The mirror was a jagged hole in the wall, reflecting only broken plaster and dangling wires. Relief flooded me, so intense it made me dizzy. It was over. I'd saved them. I'd broken the window. But as I sat there catching my breath, a single shard of mirror, no bigger than my palm, lay at my feet, unbroken. In its tiny, warped reflection, I saw not my own face. I saw Eleanor. She was standing alone in the empty nursery, the crib gone. The moonlight was gone. The room was dark, lit only by a single guttering candle. She wasn't crying. She was looking directly at me through the shard, her expression not sad but resigned, resolved. She raised her hand slowly, not in fear, but in farewell. Then she turned and walked towards the nursery door, the door that now stood wide open, revealing not darkness, but a soft, golden light spilling from a room beyond. She paused on the threshold, glancing back one last time. Her lips moved. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew them. Thank you. The shard went dark, just glass. I picked it up, the edges sharp against my skin. The cuts on my arms didn't hurt any more. A deep calm settled over me, deeper than any relief. The house felt different, not lighter, fuller. The silence wasn't empty. It was listening, waiting. I carried the shard to the kitchen and placed it carefully on the windowsill, where the morning light would find it. As I cleaned the broken glass from the hallway, I didn't sweep the largest pieces away. I left them scattered on the floorboards, glinting like fallen stars. They felt like anchors, like promises. Lena came home the next day. She hugged me tightly at the door, chattering about her trip, oblivious to the change in the air. She didn't mention the missing mirror, didn't comment on the shards glinting on the floor. She just smiled, a real warm smile I hadn't seen in months. "It feels different here," she said softly, tilting her head as if listening to a distant song. Peaceful. She didn't see the frost forming on the window pane that night, spelling out 2 words in delicate crystals. He's free. I don't cover the shard on the windowsill. I let the moonlight catch it. Sometimes in the deepest quiet of 3 a.m., I stand in the hallway where the mirror hung. The floorboards are cold under my bare feet. I close my eyes. and I hear it, faint but clear. A baby's happy gurgle and a woman's soft, contented sigh, not from the nursery, from the walls, from the very bones of the house. Eleanor isn't trapped anymore. She's home, and the shadow, it's gone, banished by broken glass and a desperate act of love. But the house remembers. It holds their peace like a sacred thing. I feel it in my own bones now, the deep, quiet warmth where the cold used to live. Last night, I placed my palm flat against the wall where the mirror hung. The plaster was warm, and beneath my hand, so faint I might have imagined it, I felt a single, gentle vibration, like a heartbeat, like a lullaby. I left my hand there until dawn painted the hallway gold. The shard on the sill caught the light, glowing like a tiny sun. I know I'll see her again, not in glass, but when my own time comes. She'll be waiting at that golden door, her hand outstretched, her eyes no longer sad. She'll lead me to the quiet room beyond the nursery door, to where the crying has finally stopped, to where we all belong. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm coming home. This is where the story ends. Let's continue with the next. My security camera captured a woman rocking an empty cradle. Downstairs, I installed the cameras because of the break-in at Mrs. Henderson's place next door. She'd been gone for 3 days visiting her sister when someone pried open her back window and took everything of value, jewelry, cash, even her late husband's watch from the nightstand. The police said it was likely kids from the high school down the street, looking for quick cash. But the violation of it, the intimacy of someone rifling through your drawers while you're away, left me shaken. I'd just moved into this old 2-story rental on Sycamore Street. A narrow Victorian with too many rooms for one person and a basement that groaned like a living thing every time the furnace kicked on. It felt vulnerable, exposed. So I spent a weekend wiring 4 security cameras, one covering the front porch, one aimed at the back door, one in the upstairs hallway outside my bedroom, and the last one mounted in the corner of the parlor downstairs, its lens angled to capture the entire room, including the antique cradle that came with the place. The landlord, Mr. Greeley, had been apologetic about the cradle. "Previous tenant left it behind," he'd said, scratching his bald spot with ink-stained fingers. "Supposed to have it hauled away, but, well, it's heavy, and honestly, it's kind of pretty, isn't it?" He wasn't wrong. It was a beautiful piece. Cherry wood darkened to near black with age, brass rails polished smooth by generations of hands, intricate scroll work along the headboard depicting vines and birds in flight. It looked like something out of a museum, not a rented house in a working-class neighborhood. But it was also deeply unsettling, not because of its appearance, but because of its placement. It sat alone in the far corner of the parlor, directly beneath the only window, as if waiting for someone to lay a child inside. I'd planned to move it to the garage until the junk haulers came, but the first time I tried to lift it, I nearly threw out my back. It was absurdly heavy for its size, as if its hollow interior had been filled with lead or stone. After straining uselessly for 10 minutes, I gave up and decided I could live with it. It was just furniture, just wood and metal. Harmless. For the first week, the cameras recorded nothing but the mundane ballet of my solitary life. Me leaving for work at 7:15 a.m., returning at 6:30 p.m., making dinner in a tiny kitchen, reading on the couch before bed. The motion alert stayed silent. The house felt safe, secure. I began to relax, chalking my initial unease up to post-break-in paranoia. Then, on a Tuesday night, the alert pinged at 2:47 a.m. I was half asleep when my phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with the notification, "Motion detected, parlor." My heart lurched into my throat. I fumbled for the phone, my fingers clumsy with sleep, and tapped the alert to open the live feed. The parlor was dark, except for the faint blue glow of the camera's night vision. At first, I saw nothing unusual. The sofa, the bookshelf, the empty armchair. Then I noticed the cradle. It was moving, not vibrating from some distant truck passing on the street, not swaying from a draft. It was rocking, slowly, deliberately, back and forth with a smooth, rhythmic motion that spoke of a hand guiding it, a human hand. But the room was empty, completely, utterly empty. No shadowy figure crouched beside it, no intruder frozen in the act of fleeing, just the cradle rocking itself in the dead of night. I watched the live feed for 10 minutes, my breath shallow, my body rigid with fear. The rocking continued without variation, steady, hypnotic, unhurried. At exactly 2:57 a.m., it stopped, abruptly, as if an invisible hand had simply let go. The cradle settled into stillness, and her room returned to its silent vigil. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I told myself it was a mechanical failure, a loose spring in the cradle's base, perhaps, activated by the house settling. Or maybe a raccoon had gotten into the walls and its movements were transferring through the floorboards. Anything but what my gut was screaming, that something had been in my parlor, something that knew how to rock a cradle. The next morning, I reviewed the footage frame by frame. There was no trick of the light, no glitch in the camera. The cradle rocked for exactly 10 minutes, starting at 2:47 a.m. and ending at 2:57 a.m. And then, in the final seconds of the clip, as the rocking slowed to a stop, I saw it. A distortion in the air above a cradle-like heat haze on a summer road. It lasted only 3 frames, but it was unmistakable. The faint outline of a woman's form, seated in the space beside the cradle, her head bowed as if watching something inside. The image was translucent, wavering, but the shape was clear. A long skirt, a slender waist, hair pulled back in a severe bun, and then it was gone. I should have left then. Packed a bag and checked into a motel. But pride and financial reality held me in place. I'd signed a year's lease. Breaking it would cost me 2 months' rent I couldn't afford. And part of me, the stubborn, rational part that had gotten me through grad school on ramen noodles and sheer willpower, refused to be chased out by what might just be faulty wiring or overactive imagination. I decided to investigate. That afternoon I called Mr. Greeley. "The cradle in the parlor," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Do you know anything about its history? Previous owners?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Just an old piece of furniture. Been in that house longer than I've owned it. Why do you ask?" "I'm just curious," I said. "It's so heavy and detailed." Another pause, longer this time. "Look," he finally said, his voice dropping slightly. "The house was built in 1893. First owner was a doctor, Silas Thorne. He and his wife Clara lived there. had a baby girl in 1895. Died of whooping cough before she was 6 months old. He cleared his throat. They kept the nursery intact for years, even after they moved out. The cradle, it was hers. Every tenant since has complained about it. Said it moves on its own. Said they hear rocking at night. I always thought it was nonsense. Old houses make noises, but... He trailed off. But what? I prompted, my mouth dry. But the last tenant, the one who left the cradle behind, she moved out after 3 weeks. Wouldn't say why. Just packed up in the middle of the night and left the key in the mailbox. When I went to check the place, the cradle was in the parlor. It had been in the upstairs nursery before. She must have moved it herself. Why would she do that? I didn't have an answer, but I knew, with a cold certainty, that settled, deep in my bones, that I wouldn't be sleeping much that night. I armed myself with logic and a flashlight. At 2:30 a.m., I crept downstairs, positioning myself in an armchair opposite the cradle, my phone recording video in my lap. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd sit there for an hour, see nothing, and finally put this ghost story to rest. But at 2:47 a.m., the air in the room changed. It grew colder, so cold I could see my breath fogging in the moonlight, filtering through the window. And then, with a soft creak that seemed to come from the wood itself, the cradle began to rock. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just watched, my phone capturing everything, as the rocking grew steadier, more pronounced. And then, slowly, a figure materialized beside the cradle, not all at once, but coalescing from the shadows like smoke given form. A woman in a high-collared black dress, her face pale and drawn, her eyes fixed on the empty space within the cradle. Her hands, translucent but unmistakable, rested on the brass rail, guiding the motion with a tenderness that broke my heart, even as it terrified me. She was humming, a soft, wordless lullaby that vibrated not in the air, but in my bones. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I couldn't look away. There was such profound sorrow in her posture, such aching love in the way her spectral fingers caressed the empty space where a child should have been. This wasn't a malevolent spirit. This was a mother trapped in the moment of her greatest loss, repeating the ritual that had once brought her daughter comfort. At 2:57 a.m., just as before, the rocking stopped. The woman's form began to fade, her eyes lifting from the cradle to meet mine through the darkness. For a single, breathless moment, we stared at each other across the gulf between worlds, and then she was gone, leaving only the scent of lavender and the echo of a lullaby in the silence. I didn't review the footage that night. I already knew what it would show. Instead, I went to the library the next day and dug through microfiche records of the local newspaper from 1895. It took hours, but I found it. A brief death notice for Eleanor Rose Thorne, aged 5 months and 12 days. A bright light extinguished too soon, the notice read. Her parents are inconsolable. Buried in the society pages was a follow-up article from 1896. Dr. and Mrs. Thorne to vacate Sycamore residence. The grieving couple plans to relocate to Boston, to be nearer to family, unable to bear the memories contained within their former home. Clara Thorne hadn't been able to leave her daughter behind. Not really. Her spirit had remained, tethered to the object most associated with her lost child. The cradle where she'd spent countless nights rocking away fevers and fussiness, where she'd whispered dreams and promises into downy hair that would never grow long. That night, I didn't hide. Upstairs. I went down to the parlor at 2:40 a.m. and sat in the armchair, a cup of tea cooling in my hands. At 2:47 a.m., the temperature dropped, and the cradle began to rock. Clara appeared as before, her form more solid this time, her eyes less focused on the cradle and more aware of my presence. She didn't seem surprised to see me, just resigned. "I know who you are," I said softly, my voice trembling but clear. "I know about Eleanor." Her head turned toward me slowly, her expression unreadable. The rocking never ceased. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry for your loss." A single tear traced a path down her translucent cheek, vanishing before it could reach her jaw. She looked back at the cradle, her hands tightening on the rail for a moment before relaxing again. The lullaby resumed, softer now, tinged with something that might have been gratitude. Night after night, I joined her. Sometimes I brought flowers, white lilies, the traditional flower of mourning, and placed them on the windowsill. Sometimes I simply sat in silence, bearing witness to her grief. The rocking never stopped. The cradle never held anything but empty air. But gradually, imperceptibly, Clara's form began to change. The lines of sorrow around her eyes softened. The tension in her shoulders eased. She began to look less like a prisoner of her pain and more like a woman learning to carry it. One night, as the first hints of dawn lightened the sky, she did something different. Instead of fading away at 2:57 a.m., she stood up from her invisible chair and walked toward me. I didn't flinch. I held her gaze as she stopped an arm's length away, her form shimmering like mist in morning sun. She reached out a hand, not to touch me, but to hover over my heart. And in that moment, I felt it. Not cold, not fear, but a wave of pure, unadulterated love so powerful it brought tears to my eyes. It was the love of a mother for her child, vast and eternal and unbroken by death. And then, with a final gentle smile, she turned and walked toward the window. As the first ray of sunlight touched the glass, her form dissolved into golden motes that scattered on an unfelt breeze. The cradle hasn't rocked since that night. I still have the cameras, but the motion alert stays silent. The house feels different now, not haunted, but peaceful, honored. I've left the cradle in the parlor. It's just wood and brass again, heavy and beautiful, and finally at rest. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I'll sit in the armchair and imagine I hear the faintest echo of a lullaby in the wind. And I know that somewhere, in whatever realm lies beyond our understanding, a mother is finally holding her daughter again. The security camera captured a ghost rocking an empty cradle. But what it couldn't capture was the love that filled that emptiness night after night, until it was enough to set them both free. And that is the end of this story. Now let's begin a new one. The House That Remembers. I am writing this from a borrowed laptop in a library in Duluth, Minnesota. I don't have a phone anymore. I don't have a car. I walked here in the snow wearing boots that aren't mine. If you're reading this and you see a listing on Airbnb for a secluded historic manor in the Black Woods with a host named Mrs. Gable, do not book it. Do not even look at the photos. The photos are a lie, but not in the way you think. The photos show the house as it wants to be seen. They don't show what it keeps in the walls. My name is Sarah. I'm a freelance photographer, or I was. I specialize in architectural photography. Abandoned places, ruins, the kind of decay porn that gets likes on Instagram. I was broke, my camera gear was pawned, and I needed a gig. When I got the email from a private client offering me $5,000 to document a family estate before it was demolished, I jumped at it. The client, a lawyer named Mr. Sterling, was vague. "The house has history," he said on the phone. His voice was tinny, like he was speaking from inside a metal box. "The family wants a record of it. Every room, every corner, but you must do it at night. The lighting is specific." "At night?" I asked. "Yes, the house wakes up at night. The architecture changes with the shadows. It's an aesthetic choice." I agreed. I rented a car, bought back my camera, and drove north. The house was located at the end of a long, overgrown driveway that wound through a forest of dead birch trees. They looked like white bones sticking out of the earth. The house itself was a monstrosity. It was Victorian, but wrong. The angles were too sharp. The windows were too narrow, like squinting eyes. It was painted a color that might have been blue once, but had rotted into a bruised purple. Mr. Sterling wasn't there. He had left a key under the mat, a heavy iron key that felt cold enough to burn my skin. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. It wasn't mold or dust. It smelled like dried flowers and old perfume, masking something underneath, something like raw meat left in the sun. The interior was pristine, dust-free. The furniture was draped in white sheets. The mirrors were covered with black cloth. I set up my gear in the foyer. It was 8 p.m. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the floorboards. I started shooting. Click, flash, whir. The first hour was normal. I moved from room to room, the library, the dining hall, the parlor. The house was beautiful in a grotesque way. The wallpaper was patterned with intricate vines that looked like arteries. The chandeliers were made of crystal drops that resembled tears. But as midnight approached, the house changed. I was in the kitchen. It was a large tiled room with a massive cast-iron stove. I was setting up my tripod to capture the stove when I heard it. Clink. It sounded like silverware hitting a plate. I froze. "Hello?" Silence. I looked around. The kitchen was empty. The drawers were closed. Clink. Scrape. It came from the dining room, the room I had just left. I grabbed my tripod, wielding it like a club, and walked slowly to the dining room doorway. The room was dark. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom. The table, which had been empty 10 minutes ago, was set. There were 4 place settings: fine china, crystal goblets, silver cutlery arranged perfectly, and in the center of the table there was a roast, a steaming hot roast beef, oozing red juices onto a silver platter. My breath caught in my throat. I was alone. I had locked the door. I walked closer. The heat from the meat hit my face. It was real. I raised my camera. I had to document this. Click. The flash illuminated the room for a split second. In that split second, I saw them. Seated at the 4 chairs were figures. They were translucent, like smoke caught in glass. A man, a woman, and 2 children. They were dressed in clothes from the 1900s, but their faces were blurred, smudged, like someone had taken an eraser to a pencil drawing. Where their eyes and mouths should be, there was just smooth gray skin. The flash died. Darkness returned. I shined my flashlight at the chairs. Empty. The food was still there. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Okay," I whispered. "Prank. Someone is messing with me." I turned to run to the front door. It was gone. Where the front door had been, there was now a wall, a solid wall covered in the artery-patterned wallpaper. I touched it. It was cold and damp. It felt like skin. I ran to the windows. They were shuttered from the outside. I tried to lift the sash, painted shut. I smashed the glass with my tripod. Behind the glass there was no outside. There were bricks, a solid wall of bricks. I was sealed in. Then the whispering started. It came from the vents, from the floorboards, from the walls themselves. She sees us. She sees the dinner. Does she want a plate? She looks hungry. I ran up the stairs. Why? I don't know. Instinct. High ground. I barricaded myself in the master bedroom. It had a heavy oak door with a bolt lock. I slid the bolt home and pushed a dresser in front of it. I sat on the bed, shaking. I checked my photos on the camera's display screen. The photo of the dining room. In the picture, the chairs were empty, but the roast beef wasn't meat. It was a human head, a severed gray head on a platter, and it was screaming. I dropped the camera. It hit the floor and the lens shattered. I huddled in the corner. This isn't real. This isn't real. Knock, knock, knock. 3 polite taps on the bedroom door. "Room service," a voice called. It was a cheerful sing-song voice, a maid's voice. "Go away," I screamed. "But you didn't finish your dinner, miss," the voice said. "The master is offended." The doorknob rattled, slowly, then violently. The heavy dresser began to slide across the floor. Something with immense strength was pushing the door open. I looked around the room. There was a fireplace, a chimney. It was my only way out. I grabbed the fire poker and ran to the hearth. I looked up. It was dark, narrow, and smelled of soot. The bedroom door splintered. A hand reached through. It was gray, elongated, with fingers that had too many joints. I climbed into the fireplace. I pulled myself up onto the smoke shelf. I heard the door smash open. I heard heavy, wet footsteps enter the room. "Where is the little mouse?" a deep, guttural voice growled. "She went up the chimney, sir," the maid's voice giggled. "Smoke her out," the deep voice said. I heard the strike of a match, then the whoosh of flames. Heat surged up the chimney. Smoke billowed around me. I coughed, my eyes burning. I climbed. I clawed at the rough bricks, tearing my fingernails. The heat was scorching the soles of my boots. I climbed until I saw stars. I pulled myself out onto the roof. I collapsed on the cold slate tiles, gasping for air. The smoke poured out of the chimney next to me, thick and black. I looked down. It was a 30-foot drop to the ground. But the ground was moving. The lawn wasn't grass. It was a sea of hands. Thousands of gray, spectral hands reaching up from the earth, grasping at the air. "Jump," they whispered. "Join us." I looked around the roof. There was a trellis on the side of the house, covered in dead vines. I crawled to it. I swung my legs over the edge. As I climbed down, I looked into the windows on the second floor. In every window, a face was watching me. The smudged faces, the eraser people, they were pressing against the glass, their featureless heads tracking my movement. And behind them, in the hallway, stood a tall shadow. It wore a top hat. It held a silver platter. I reached the ground. The spectral hands grabbed at my boots, but they were weak, misty. I kicked through them. I ran to my car. I fumbled for my keys. They were gone. I must have dropped them inside. I looked at the car. The tires were slashed, all 4 of them, and on the hood, scratched into the paint, were words, "Stay for dessert." I didn't stop. I ran into the woods. I ran until my lungs burned. I ran until the sun came up. I found a road. A truck driver picked me up. He didn't ask questions about the soot or the blood or the fact that I was crying hysterically. He dropped me off here in Duluth. I went to the police. I told them everything. They looked up the address I gave them. "Ma'am," the officer said gently, "there is no house at that location. That's the old Blackwood fire zone. A manor burned down there in 1922. Killed the whole family. They say the father went mad and poisoned them at dinner before setting the place alight." "I was there," I insisted. "I have photos." I reached for my camera bag. It was empty. The camera was gone. I had dropped it in the bedroom, but I found something else in the bag, a silver fork. It was heavy, tarnished antique silver, and engraved on the handle was a name, Sterling. The lawyer, the client. He wasn't a lawyer, he was one of them. I left the station. I pawned the fork for cash. That's how I'm surviving. But here is why I'm writing this. Here is why I am terrified. Yesterday, I bought a disposable camera to take photos for a new job listing I found. Landscape work, safe work. I developed the film at a 1-hour photo lab. The first 12 photos were just trees and lakes. But the last photo, I didn't take the last photo. It shows me, sleeping. In the motel room I stayed in last night, I'm asleep in the bed. And standing over me, looking down at my face, are the 4 smudged figures, the family, and in the corner of the room, reflected in the mirror, is the tall shadow with the top hat. He is holding a silver platter, and on the platter there is a camera lens. My broken camera lens. They followed me. They are not bound to the house. The house is just where they eat. And they are still hungry. I am leaving this laptop here. I am leaving this town. I don't know where I'm going. Somewhere crowded, somewhere bright. But I know it won't matter, because just now, as I was typing this, the librarian walked by. She smiled at me, but for a split second, her face blurred. Her eyes and mouth disappeared, leaving only smooth gray skin. And she whispered, in a voice that sounded like silverware on a plate, "Dinner is served." As this story comes to rest, a new whisper begins. The ghost in my house isn't trying to scare me. It's trying to warn me. The house smelled like damp paper and forgotten things. Not the cozy cinnamon and dust scent of an old home, but the stale, hollow breath of abandonment. It crouched at the end of Sycamore Street, a 2-story craftsman with peeling sage-green paint, a sagging porch roof held up by one splintered beam, and windows so grimy the weak November sunlight barely penetrated the gloom inside. The rent was $450 a month, cash, no credit check, no questions asked. Just Mrs. Peabody, the ancient owner who lived 3 towns over, meeting me on the cracked front step with a ring of heavy keys and eyes that darted past my shoulder as she spoke. "Quiet street," she'd mumbled, her voice papery and thin. "House has history, good bones, just needs attention." She wouldn't look at the house directly. Her hand trembled as she handed me the keys. "Mind the basement door. It sticks. And the 3rd step on the back stairs. It's loose. Watch your step." She turned to leave before I could ask about utilities, vanishing into her battered Buick like a shadow retreating from light. I didn't care about the warnings. I needed walls. After the divorce papers were signed, the final, brutal severing after Mark's affair shattered the last 10 years of my life. I'd crashed on my sister's couch until her husband's polite coughs became too loud to ignore. This house, this decaying husk, was freedom, or at least shelter. I hauled my mismatched boxes inside, the empty rooms echoing with every footstep. The air was cold, unnaturally so for late autumn, carrying a faint Swedish undertone like old flowers left too long in stagnant water. The previous tenant, Mrs. Peabody said vaguely, was an elderly man who passed peacefully. No details, no forwarding address, just a single dusty armchair left in the living room and a lingering scent of menthol rub. The first week was just the usual settling in, chaos, unpacking, patching holes in the plaster walls, scrubbing decades of grime from the bathroom tiles. The house groaned and sighed like all old structures do. Floorboards creaked underfoot. Pipes clanked when the ancient radiator kicked on. I chalked the cold drafts to poor insulation and rattling windows to the wind whipping down the valley. But then the small things started. Things a rational mind tries desperately to explain away. My favorite mug, a chipped blue ceramic one Mark had bought me on our honeymoon in Mexico, was found one morning not on the kitchen hook where I always hung it, but sitting squarely in the center of the dining table. I'd left it drying on the rack the night before. I blamed fatigue. Then my keys, meticulously placed on the hall table every evening, appeared on the bathroom sink twice in 3 days. I checked the locks obsessively, but the doors were always bolted tight, windows latched, no sign of forced entry, just misplaced objects. Annoying, but explicable. Stress, sleep deprivation, the house playing tricks on a mind already frayed by grief. Then came the cold spots, not the diffuse chill of a drafty room, but focused, intense pockets of cold air that seemed to cling to specific places. One hovered near the foot of the stairs, another lingered by the basement door. A heavy, scarred thing with a tarnished brass knob that refused to turn smoothly. The most persistent one settled in the corner of my bedroom, near the closet. It wasn't just cold, it felt dense, heavy, like stepping into water. I'd wake shivering in the night, pull the covers tighter, and find myself staring at that corner, a primal unease prickling my skin. My breath fogged in the moonlight, slicing through the window. I'd tell myself it was the house's poor heating, a draft from the old window frame. But the rationalizations felt flimsy, worn thin. The dreams started soon after, vivid, suffocating things. I'd be standing on the porch, looking down Sycamore Street, but the houses were wrong, tilted, melting like wax. A figure would appear at the end of the road, silhouetted against the streetlight, tall, broad-shouldered, walking slowly, deliberately toward the house. I never saw his face, only the shape of him radiating a quiet menace that froze me to the spot. I'd wake gasping, sweat cooling instantly in the bedroom's cold corner. The image burned into my mind. I started locking the front door twice at night, sliding the deadbolt with trembling hands, peering through the peephole into the empty, moonlit street. One rainy Tuesday, I came home from my part-time job at the library to find the kitchen flooded. Not a burst pipe flood, but a deliberate ankle-deep puddle spreading from the sink. The faucet was off. tight. Yet water streamed steadily from the tap's base, pooling on the linoleum. I mopped it up, cursing the ancient plumbing, but the next morning it was dry, bone dry, no trace of moisture, no explanation. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the rain drum on the roof, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tap, 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 coming from the living room, like knuckles rapping gently on wood, not the pipes, not the wind, deliberate, patient. I lay frozen, heart pounding against my ribs, until dawn painted the ceiling gray. When I crept downstairs, the room was empty, silent. But the armchair, the one left by the previous tenant, was turned slightly as if someone had just risen from it. Its faded floral upholstery was ice cold to the touch. Fear finally overrode my stubborn practicality. I bought sage from the New Age shop downtown, burning it in the corners, choking on the acrid smoke, whispering desperate pleas for whatever was here to leave me alone. Nothing changed. The cold spot in the bedroom deepened. The tapping continued on quiet nights, and the dreams intensified. The figure on Sycamore Street was closer now. I could almost make out the shape of a heavy coat, the glint of something metallic in his hand. I'd wake screaming, the echo of my own voice swallowed by the house's stillness, the cold corner pressing in like a physical weight. Then the warnings began, not subtle nudges, but urgent, impossible messages. I kept my medication, a low-dose antidepressant, in a small orange bottle on the kitchen counter. One morning, I opened it to find every single pill replaced with smooth gray river stones, identical in size and shape to the pills, but cold and inert. My blood ran cold. I hadn't left the bottle out. I kept it in the locked medicine cabinet. I poured the stones down the sink, hands shaking, and refilled it from my emergency stash in my suitcase. 2 days later, I found the bottle on the dining table again, empty. The pills were scattered across the floor beneath the basement door, as if thrown violently. The basement door itself was slightly ajar, though I knew I'd latched it tight the night before. The heavy brass knob was icy. That same evening, I noticed the clocks, all of them, the battery-powered kitchen clock, the ancient wall clock in the hall, even my wristwatch, were stopped, stuck at 3:07 a.m. I reset them, replaced the kitchen clock's battery. By morning, they were all frozen again at 3:07. The time felt significant, but I couldn't place why. The final straw wasn't for me. It was for Mrs. Gable, the sweet, white-haired widow who lived 3 houses down. She'd taken a shine to me, bringing over a still warm apple pie my second week here, her eyes kind behind thick glasses. "You look like you carried a world, dear," she'd said, patting my hand. "This old place needs some cheer. You give it that." She'd been checking in regularly, concerned about the house's state, offering gardening tips for the overgrown yard. One Tuesday afternoon, she brought me a basket of late-season tomatoes from her garden. As she stood on my porch, chatting about her cat, Mr. Whiskers, I felt it, the cold spot. It didn't hover near the corner this time. It enveloped her. A visible mist formed the air around her shoulders. Her cheerful chatter faltered. She shivered violently, pulling her cardigan tight. "Goodness, child," she murmured, her voice tight. "It's turned bitter cold all of a sudden, like a grave opened up." She left quickly, casting nervous glances back at my house. That night, the tapping was frantic. Tap, 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 tap. Not on the wall, but on the window, beside my bed. I fumbled for the lamp, my fingers numb with cold from the corner. The streetlight cast long shadows, but the window was empty, only rain streaking the glass. Then I saw it, written on the fogged pane, as if drawn by an invisible finger. Don't trust him. He watches. 3:07. My breath caught. Him? Who? The figure from my dreams? I pressed my palm against the cold glass, wiping away the condensation. The words vanished. But the message was seared into my mind. The next day was Saturday. I needed groceries. As I locked my front door, I saw Walter. He lived across the street in the only well-kept house on the block, a neat brick bungalow with manicured hedges. Walter was in his late 50s, retired military, always impeccably dressed in khakis and polo shirts. He'd waved hello a few times, offered to help carry boxes when I first moved in. He seemed normal, friendly, the kind of neighbor you'd want. He was raking leaves in his yard, his movements precise, efficient. He smiled and waved as I walked to my car. "Morning, Sarah. Settling in okay over there?" His voice was warm, reassuring. I forced a smile back. "Getting there, Walter. Thanks." As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. His smile had vanished. His eyes fixed on my house were flat and watchful, utterly devoid of warmth. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather slithered down my spine. He watches. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the armchair. In the living room, a kitchen knife gripped in my sweating hand, the lights blazing. The house was unnaturally silent. No tapping, no pipes, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the frantic pounding of my own heart. 2:45 a.m., 2:55 a.m., 3 a.m. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked with agonizing slowness. 3:05, 3:06. At 3:07 a.m., the lights died, not a flicker. Total, suffocating darkness. The hum of the refrigerator ceased. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, pressing in on my eardrums. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with terror. The screen flared to life, casting a sickly blue glow. No signal. Battery at 1%. I was alone in the black. Then a sound from the kitchen, not tapping. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy boots on the linoleum. Coming down the hall, I scrambled back in the chair, the knife raised, tears streaming down my face. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room archway. The darkness felt alive, breathing. I could smell it now. The sweet, cloying scent of old flowers mixed with the sharp tang of damp earth. The cold spot wasn't a spot anymore. It was a presence filling the doorway. A shape coalesced in the gloom. Not the broad-shouldered figure from my dreams. This was different. Frail, hunched, wearing a shapeless, old-fashioned housecoat. The face was indistinct, blurred like a photograph left in the rain, but the eyes, they held a deep, sorrowful intelligence. It wasn't looking at me. It was looking past me, toward the front door. Its hand, translucent, shimmering like heat haze, rose slowly, not to touch me, to point, toward the door, toward the street, toward Walter's house. A sound escaped it, not a voice, but a vibration in the air, a dry rustle like dead leaves skittering on stone, carrying words directly into my mind. He comes, soon, at the turning dark. He knows you are alone. He knows the weak door. He takes the quiet ones. He took me. The image flashed in my mind, unbidden, horrifyingly clear. An elderly man, Arthur, his name surfaced in my terror, sitting in this very armchair. The basement door swinging open just a crack, heavy footsteps on the stairs, a gloved hand covering Arthur's mouth, the glint of a knife. The struggle was silent, over quickly. The body dragged down into the dark, the basement. 3:07 a.m., the time Arthur died, the time Walter always struck, the figure, Arthur, turned those sorrowful eyes on me. The cold intensified, biting into my bones, but there was no malice in it, only desperate urgency. The vibration came again, weaker now, fraying at the edges. Warn. Others. The widow. He watches her cat. Waits for her door to open. Stop him. Please. The front door rattled, not the wind, a firm testing shake of the knob, then a soft rhythmic scrape, metal on wood. He was picking the lock. Walter, he'd come for me, just as he'd come for Arthur, just as he'd planned to come for Mrs. Gable after he saw her. Leave my house, vulnerable and trusting. Panic surged, but beneath it, a fierce, protective anger ignited. Arthur hadn't haunted me to scare me. He'd tried to warn me. He'd tried to save Mrs. Gable. He'd spent years trapped here, trying to stop this from happening again. I couldn't let him down. I couldn't let Walter win. As the lock clicked open and a door creaked inward, spilling moonlight across the threshold, I didn't scream. I lunged, not at the shadowy figure stepping inside, the silhouette of Walter, tall and broad-shouldered, a dark shape in his hand, but toward the telephone on the hall table. Arthur's cold presence surged around me, a wave of icy energy that seemed to slow time. The air crackled. The overhead light fixture in the hall flared with a blinding blue-white light, shattering the bulb in a shower of sparks. Walter stumbled back with a curse, momentarily blinded. I grabbed the phone. Dead. No dial tone, of course. He'd cut the line. But my cell phone. I dropped it on the floor near the armchair. I scrambled for it, Arthur's chilling presence swirling around Walter like a shield, holding him at bay in the doorway. The phone screen was black. No power. 0%. Witch! Walter snarled, shaking off the disorientation, raising the knife, a long, wicked butcher's blade. Should have stayed quiet like the old man and the busybody next door. I threw the phone at him. It bounced harmlessly off his shoulder. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound, stepping fully into the hall. That's when I saw it. The basement door. Arthur had willed it open, just a crack, and the cold spot. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was a vortex, a pulling force. I didn't think. I ran, not toward the front door, but past Walter, toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen, toward the back door. Arthur's presence surged after me, a visible wave of frost spreading across the floorboards behind Walter's boots. Walter turned, confused by the unnatural cold biting at his ankles, the frost climbing the legs of his khakis. He slipped on the icy linoleum, crashing hard onto his back, the knife clattering away. I wrenched open the back door, stumbling out into the rain-slicked yard. I didn't stop. I ran straight to Mrs. Gable's house, pounding on her door until she opened it, blinking in her robe, Mr. Whiskers twining around her ankles. "Walter!" I gasped, rain and tears streaming down my face. "Call the police. Now. He's in my house. He tried to kill me. He killed Arthur years ago. He's going to kill you next." Her face went pale, but she didn't hesitate. She pulled me inside, locking her deadbolt, and dialed 911 with shaking hands. I told the dispatcher everything. Arthur, the warnings, the cold spots, the writing on the window, the time, the basement, Walter's plan for her. I sounded hysterical, but Mrs. Gable stood beside me, nodding fiercely, her hand on my arm. "She's telling the truth," she told. The dispatcher, her voice surprisingly steady. "Walter Henderson has been odd, watching, asking about my routines, And Arthur Finch did disappear from that house in '98. They never found him. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. We waited in Mrs. Gable's warm, brightly lit kitchen, the smell of chamomile tea she insisted on making cutting through the fear. When the police arrived, they found Walter still in my hallway, shivering uncontrollably, frost coating his clothes and hair despite the indoor temperature, babbling about the cold man and the old one in the walls. They found the knife, and when they descended into the damp root-cellar darkness of my basement, guided by Mrs. Gable's trembling finger pointing to a freshly disturbed patch of dirt near the old coal chute, they found Arthur Finch's bones. Walter confessed quickly. It was easier than fighting the impossible cold that had frozen his joints that night, he said. He'd killed Arthur over a disputed property line. He'd watched Mrs. Gable for months, waiting for the perfect moment when she'd be alone, vulnerable after letting her cat out. He'd seen me move in, alone and grieving, an easy target. The house is weak, he muttered to the detectives, his teeth chattering. It lets things in, things that don't like me. They tried to stop me before with the clocks, the stones, the cold. He refused to say more. I moved out the next week, sold everything I could carry. Mrs. Gable hugged me tightly at the bus stop, pressing a small, smooth river stone into my palm. For luck, dear, she whispered, and remembrance. I never went back to Sycamore Street, but sometimes, on quiet nights, when the world feels too loud and the grief for my old life resurfaces, I sit very still, and I listen, not for taps or footsteps, but for a different kind of silence, a warm, watchful quiet, because the cold spot in the corner of my new, well-lit apartment, it's gone, vanished, the moment Walter was led away in handcuffs. But in its place, there's a gentle warmth, like sunlight on old wood, like a hand resting lightly, reassuringly on my shoulder when the shadows feel too deep. Arthur isn't trapped anymore. He's free, and he's still watching, not to warn me of monsters in the dark, but to remind me that even in the deepest silence, I'm not alone. The house didn't haunt me. It saved me. And sometimes, in the safest moments, I swear I hear the faint, contented sigh of an old armchair settling. Just once. Then silence. The good kind. And so, this story comes to an end. Let's start another. The Ghost in Apartment 4. B. Keeps leaving. Fresh flowers on my pillow. I should have asked why the rent was so low. That's the thought that echoes through my mind now, lying awake at 3 a.m., with the scent of lilies thick in the air and another offering resting on my pillow, a single white camellia, dewdrop still glistening on its petals, though no florist in this city would have them in November. But when I signed the lease 3 weeks ago, desperation had clouded my judgment. Fresh out of grad school with a useless degree in art history and $20,000 of student debt, I'd been sleeping on a friend's couch for 2 months when I found the listing for 3B at the Hawthorne Arms. 1 bedroom, hardwood floors, bay window, $650 a month. Half the market rate for anything remotely habitable in the city. The property manager, a harried woman named Diane who smelled of cigarette smoke and regret, had barely looked at my application before sliding the lease across her desk. Just one rule, she'd said, tapping a chipped fingernail against the paper. Don't go up to 4B. It's been vacant since the incident. Building code violation. Stairs are unsafe. She'd said it so casually, like mentioning a broken elevator or spotty Wi-Fi. I'd signed without asking what incident she meant. The Hawthorne Arms was a 5-story walk-up built in 1923, all crumbling brick and ornate cornices blackened by decades of city soot. My apartment, 3B, was smaller than advertised but charming in its decay. The bay window overlooked a narrow alley where fire escapes zigzagged up the neighboring building. The kitchen had actual cabinets instead of particle board shelves, and the bedroom ceiling curved in a gentle barrel vault that made the space feel like a sanctuary. The only oddity was the ceiling itself, directly above my bed, centered perfectly as if placed there with intention, was a water stain in the shape of a weeping willow. I noticed it the first night, lying in my sleeping bag on the bare mattress, my few boxes stacked against the walls. The stain wasn't new. The plaster around it was yellowed with age. But it was unmistakable, a graceful cascade of branches drooping toward the floor, each tendril rendered in shades of ochre and umber. I fell asleep wondering what pipe had burst years ago to create such an elegant ruin. I woke at dawn to the scent of gardenias, not the cloying, artificial fragrance of air freshener or candle wax, but the real thing, the heavy, intoxicating perfume of fresh-cut blooms. Disoriented, I sat up and found them immediately. 3 perfect gardenias nestled in the hollow my head had left on the pillow, their waxy white petals cool against my fingertips. I stared at them for a full minute, my sleep-fogged mind cycling through explanations. A welcome gift from a neighbor? But I'd met no one in the building. A prank from the previous tenant? But Diane had assured me the apartment had been professionally cleaned and vacant for 6 weeks. I finally decided I must have bought them myself the day before during my furniture shopping frenzy and forgotten in my exhaustion. It was the only rational explanation. I placed the flowers in a glass of water on the windowsill and went about my day. The next morning, it was lilacs, a small bouquet bound with twine resting precisely where my head had been. These I couldn't explain away. I hadn't left the building since returning from my job hunt the previous afternoon, and the nearest florist was 10 blocks away. My heart began to beat faster as I examined the blooms. They were impossibly fresh, the purple petals unfurling perfectly, stems crisp and unblemished. No florist's tag, no note, just flowers appearing overnight on my pillow like an offering. I spent that day researching the building. The local library's microfiche archives held a century of city newspapers. It took 3 hours of squinting at flickering images before I found it. A brief article from April 1987, buried on page 14, woman found deceased in Hawthorne Arms apartment. Eleanor Voss, 72, a retired botanist and lifelong resident of apartment 4B, had been discovered by her nephew after failing to answer phone calls for a week. Cause of death. Natural causes. But the article contained a curious detail that made my blood run cold. Ms. Voss was known throughout the neighborhood for her rooftop garden, where she cultivated rare blooms year-round. Neighbors reported receiving fresh-cut flowers on their doorsteps on birthdays and holidays, a tradition Ms. Voss maintained for over 40 years. The article concluded with a quote from the building manager at the time. "She died peacefully in her sleep, but we'll all miss those flowers on our pillows in the morning. She had a way of knowing when someone needed cheering up. Apartment 4B, the one directly above mine, the one I'd been warned not to visit. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old building, the groan of pipes, the whisper of wind through ill-fitting windows, sounded like footsteps overhead. I lay rigid in bed, staring at the willow-shaped stain on the ceiling, imagining an elderly woman moving silently through the apartment above, snipping blossoms from some impossible garden, descending through floors that shouldn't permit passage, placing flowers on my pillow with hands that no longer existed in the physical world. By 4 a.m., exhaustion overtook fear. I fell into a fitful sleep. I woke to roses. Not a bouquet, a single deep crimson rose, its thorns carefully removed, lying across my pillow like a sacrament. Panic finally broke through my rationalizations. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't coincidence. Something was happening in this apartment, and I needed answers. I dressed quickly and went downstairs to the basement-level office where Diane held court amid stacks of unpaid invoices and broken appliances. She was on the phone when I entered, waving me to a chair without looking up. When she hung up, she lit a cigarette before speaking. "Problem with the apartment?" "Who was Eleanor Voss?" I asked directly. Diane's face shuddered instantly. She took a long drag on her cigarette, exhaling smoke toward the water-stained ceiling. "Where'd you hear that name?" "The library archives. She lived in 4B. She died there in 1987. Another drag, a long silence. "Good tenant. Paid rent on time for 43 years. Never complained about the roaches or the heat." She stubbed out the cigarette with unnecessary force. "What's this about?" "Flowers keep appearing on my pillow," I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound calm. "Fresh flowers, every morning, gardenias, lilacs, roses. It's November. Where would they come from?" Diane went very still. When she looked at me, her eyes held something I hadn't seen before. Not annoyance or boredom, but genuine fear. "You didn't go up there, did you? To 4B? "No, you said not to." "Good." She stood up, walked to a filing cabinet, and rummaged through a drawer before producing a yellowed key attached to a wooden tag marked 4B. "I shouldn't do this. Building code violation. Stairs are unsafe." She handed me the key. Her fingers were cold. "But if you're getting flowers, you should see for yourself. Maybe it'll stop if you understand." The staircase to the 4th floor was narrow and steep, the banister loose in my grip. The door to 4B stood at the end of a short hallway, its paint blistered and peeling. The key turned with a gritty resistance, the lock protesting decades of disuse. When I pushed the door open, the scent hit me first. Not decay or dust, but the overwhelming perfume of 1,000 blooms in full blossom. Apartment 4B was not empty. It was a garden. Every surface bloomed with impossible life. Vines cascaded from the ceiling fixtures, heavy with jasmine and honeysuckle. Roses climbed the walls in riotous profusion, their thorns snagging on faded wallpaper. Orchids spilled from cracked teacups on the mantelpiece. Lilies nodded their heavy heads in corners where floorboards had rotted away to reveal rich, dark soil beneath. The air hummed with the sound of bees in November inside a sealed apartment, and the light filtering through the grimy windows seemed to carry a golden pollen dust that settled on my skin like blessing. But beneath the beauty lay tragedy. In the center of the main room stood a four-poster bed, its canopy draped with wisteria. And on that bed, propped against pillows, sprouting tiny violets from their seams, sat a skeleton, not scattered or disturbed, arranged with care, the bones still connected by desiccated ligaments, wearing the tattered remains of a floral print dress. The skull rested at a gentle angle, empty sockets gazing toward the ceiling where a magnificent wisteria vine bloomed with impossible purple clusters. In the bony fingers of the right hand rested a pair of pruning shears, their blades still sharp. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. This was Eleanor Voss. She hadn't been discovered by her nephew after a week. She'd been here for 35 years, her body becoming part of the ecosystem she'd cultivated, her bones feeding the roots of the garden she'd refused to abandon even in death. And then I saw the staircase. In the corner of the room, nearly hidden by cascading trumpet vines, a narrow servant stairway spiraled upward through a hole in the ceiling, toward the roof, toward the legendary rooftop garden the newspaper article had mentioned. But as I stared, I realized the truth. The garden wasn't just on the roof. It was everywhere. It had grown downward through floorboards, upward through plaster, sideways through walls. It had consumed this apartment entirely, and its roots surely extended into mine below, into the very ceiling above my bed, where the willow-shaped stain bloomed like a map of its subterranean spread. I fled 4B without touching anything, locking the door behind me and dropping the key into the mail slot of Diane's office on my way out. I didn't return to my apartment until nightfall, my hand still trembling, my mind reeling with what I'd witnessed. I considered packing my bags and leaving immediately. But where would I go? I had no money for another security deposit, no friends with spare rooms. And beneath the terror lurked a strange, unsettling curiosity. Why me? Why these particular flowers? Why the careful placement on my pillow, never on the floor or nightstand, always precisely where my head had rested? That night, I decided to stay awake. I dragged my mattress into the living room as far from the bedroom as possible, and settled in with a book and a pot of strong coffee. Midnight passed. 1 a.m. 2 a.m. The building settled around me with its usual symphony of creaks and sighs. At 3:17 a.m. I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound from the bedroom. Not footsteps, something gentler, the whisper of petals brushing against cotton, the faint snip of shears. I didn't move, I barely breathed. The sound lasted perhaps 30 seconds, then ceased. Silence returned, deeper than before. I waited until dawn painted the fire escapes outside my window in shades of rose and gold, before creeping toward the bedroom doorway. I stood there for a full minute, gathering courage, before stepping inside. The mattress had been moved back to its original position beneath the willow stain, and on the pillow rested a single sprig of rosemary, its needles impossibly green and fragrant, a herb of remembrance. I broke down then, not from fear, but from the unbearable tenderness of it. This wasn't a haunting meant to terrify. It was a ritual of care. Eleanor Voss, in her decades of solitude, had made it her purpose to bring beauty to the lives of those around her. Death had not ended that purpose. It had merely transformed its method. The flowers weren't a threat. They were a gift, a lonely ghost's attempt at connection. The next day, I returned to the library. I spent hours digging through archives, piecing together Eleanor's life from obituaries, society pages, and botanical society newsletters. She'd been a respected botanist who'd published 3 books on heirloom roses before retiring in 1965. She'd never married, no children. Her only living relative, the nephew mentioned in the 1987 article, had died himself in 2003, according to his own obituary. She lived alone in 4B for nearly 60 years, her world shrinking to the dimensions of her apartment and rooftop garden until the two became indistinguishable. I also found her final publication, a self-published chapbook from 1986 titled The Language of Forgotten Blooms, a guide to the symbolic meanings of flowers no longer commonly cultivated. I photocopied the relevant pages: gardenias for secret love, lilacs for first emotions of love, roses for deep devotion, rosemary for remembrance. Each flower left on my pillow carried a specific message. But what was she trying to tell me? That evening I made a decision. I went to the grocery store and bought the most beautiful bouquet I could afford. 12 white stargazer lilies, their petals speckled with crimson, their scent powerful enough to fill a room. I carried them upstairs, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. In my apartment, I arranged them carefully in a vase I'd found at a thrift store, then carried the vase into the bedroom and placed it directly beneath the willow-shaped stain on the ceiling. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty room, "for the flowers, for remembering me." I went to bed that night with the vase on my nightstand, the lily's perfume mingling with the lingering scent of rosemary. I fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from days of anxiety. I woke to silence. No flowers on my pillow, no scent of blossoms beyond the lilies I'd placed myself. For a moment, relief flooded me. Perhaps my gesture had been understood. Perhaps the haunting was over. But as I sat up, I noticed something different about the ceiling stain. The willow branches seemed darker, more defined, and at the base of the trunk, where previously there had been only a vague smudge of discoloration, now appeared 2 distinct shapes, the delicate outline of pruning shears crossed with a trowel. That day, I didn't look for work. I went to a garden center instead and bought potting soil, seeds, and a small terracotta pot. That evening, I planted forget-me-nots on my windowsill, the flower of true love and memories, and watered them carefully before placing the pot beneath the willow stain. The next morning, no flowers appeared on my pillow, but when I looked up at the ceiling, the stain had changed again. The willow now bore tiny buds along its branches, dozens of minute protrusions that hadn't been there before, each one the precise shape of a flower bud waiting to open. A pattern emerged over the following weeks. I would leave offerings, a new plant on the windowsill, a packet of seeds tucked into the vase, once a small watering can I'd found at a flea market. And each night the willow stain would respond, its branches growing more intricate, its form shifting to incorporate the tools and symbols of gardening. It was a conversation conducted in silence and symbolism, a dialogue between the living and the dead, mediated by the language of blooms. I stopped fearing the flowers. I began to look forward to them, not as supernatural intrusions, but as messages from a lonely soul who had found in me someone willing to listen. One rainy Tuesday evening, As I was repotting a peace lily I'd acquired from a neighbor, I heard it for the first time. A sound that wasn't the whisper of petals or the snip of shears. A voice, faint as breath on glass, coming not from above, but from within the walls themselves. "Your hands!" I froze, trowel hovering over the soil. "Your hands remember the earth," the voice continued, so soft I might have imagined it, like mine did. I didn't speak. I simply held my breath and listened. "Show me," the voice whispered. "Show me you remember." Trembling, I pressed my palms into the fresh potting soil, feeling its cool dampness seep between my fingers. I worked the soil gently around the peace lily's roots, patting it firm, my movements slow and deliberate. When I finished, I wiped my hands on a towel and looked up at the ceiling. The willow stain had transformed completely. Where before there had been only branches, now hung hundreds of tiny blossoms, each one a perfect replica of the flowers that had appeared on my pillow these past weeks. Gardenias, lilacs, roses, rosemary, and in the center of the canopy, a single white camellia bloomed larger than the rest, its petals seeming to pulse with a soft inner light. That night, for the first time, I had dreamed of her, not as a skeleton in a floral dress, but as she must have been in life. An elderly woman with kind eyes and soil-stained hands, kneeling in a rooftop garden under a sky full of stars. She wasn't speaking to me, but working silently among her plants, her movements graceful and sure. And as I watched, she turned and looked directly at me, not with the empty sockets of a skull, but with eyes full of warmth and recognition. She pointed to a patch of bare earth beside her, then patted the soil twice, a clear invitation. I woke with tears on my cheeks and the scent of night-blooming jasmine thick in the air. On my pillow rested not a flower, but a single-seed packet. I picked it up with trembling hands. The label was handwritten in elegant script, "Eleanor's Moonflowers, blooms only under starlight." The next evening, as twilight settled over the city, I carried a small trowel and the seed packet up to the roof. The door was unlocked, had been all along, I realized, and the stairs groaned under my weight, but held firm. The rooftop was not the overgrown jungle I'd imagined from 4B's interior. It was a ruin. Cracked concrete, rusted railings, a few stubborn weeds pushing through fissures in the pavement. No garden remained, no trace of the paradise Eleanor Voss had cultivated for 60 years. But in the center of the roof, directly above my bedroom, the concrete had split open in a perfect circle 6 feet across. And from that fissure grew a single plant, a vine with heart-shaped leaves and tightly furled buds the color of pearl. Moonflowers, Eleanor's moonflowers. I knelt beside the plant as true darkness fell. One by one, the buds began to unfurl, their petals opening with an almost audible sigh to reveal blossoms of impossible whiteness that seemed to drink the starlight and glow with their own radiance. And as I watched them bloom, I felt a presence settle beside me, not cold or menacing, but warm as sunlight on soil. I didn't turn to look. I simply sat there in the company of a ghost, both of us gazing at flowers that bloomed only for those who remembered how to see them. The flowers on my pillow stopped after that night. The haunting, if that's what it ever was, had reached its purpose. But sometimes, on clear nights when I can't sleep, I climb to the roof and sit beside the moonflowers as they open beneath the stars. And if I listen closely, I can hear it, the soft whisper of petals in the wind that sounds almost like a voice saying, "Thank you." The building manager never asks why I spend so much time on the roof. Diane retired last spring, and the new manager doesn't care as long as the rent clears. The other tenants occasionally leave small offerings on their windowsills, a packet of seeds, a watering can left out after rain, and sometimes in the morning they find a single perfect bloom waiting for them. A silent exchange, a tradition renewed. I still live in 3B. I've hung shelves on the bedroom wall beneath the willow stain, filling them with books on botany and horticulture. The stain itself has faded over the years, its branches softening into abstraction until only I can still see the shape of the tree within the discoloration. But on certain mornings, when the light strikes the ceiling at just the right angle, I can still make out the faint impression of pruning shears crossed with a trowel, and sometimes, if I look very closely, the delicate outline of two figures kneeling side by side in a garden that exists nowhere and everywhere at once. Last week, a young couple moved into 2B below me. The woman is an artist. The man teaches poetry at the community college. They seem kind, lonely in the particular way of newcomers to a city that doesn't yet know their names. This morning, as I was leaving for work, I saw her standing in the hallway looking lost, a single suitcase at her feet, while her partner sorted through a box of kitchenware inside their apartment. I went upstairs to my apartment, selected a cutting from the peace lily that now thrives on my windowsill, and placed it in a small pot with fresh soil. I carried it down to 2B and knocked softly on their door. When she opened it, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and uncertainty, I simply handed her the plant. "For your windowsill," I said. "It likes the morning light." She took it with trembling hands, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "How did you know I needed this?" I didn't answer. I just smiled and walked away, already thinking about the seed packets I'd bought yesterday. Zinnias for friendship, lavender for devotion, sunflowers for adoration, small offerings, simple gestures, the language of blooms passed down through generations of lonely souls learning to reach across the chasms that separate us. Some ghosts don't rattle chains or whisper threats in the dark. Some simply leave flowers on your pillow to remind you that beauty persists. That connection is possible even across the greatest divides. That no one need remain alone if someone is willing to plant seeds in the dark and wait for them to bloom. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the moonflowers on the roof are closed tight against the coming light, I like to imagine Eleanor Voss, not as a skeleton in a floral dress, but as she is now, a presence woven into the very fabric of this building, her hands still tending the garden she loved, her heart still reaching out through roots and stems and petals to touch the lives of those who remember how to receive a gift left gently on a pillow in the night. This is where the story ends. Let's continue with the next. The ghost who keeps rearranging the furniture while I sleep. It started with the armchair. Just a subtle shift, really. I'd left it angled towards the window, catching the late afternoon sun as I read. I woke the next morning, groggy and disoriented, to find it turned squarely to face the television instead, the worn corduroy cushion perfectly aligned with the center of the screen. A trick of the light, I told myself, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Maybe I'd absent-mindedly moved it after my third cup of coffee the night before and forgotten. Easy enough to dismiss. I turned it back. Problem solved. 2 nights later, it was the bookshelf. Not moved exactly, but reoriented. The heavy oak piece, which had stood flush against the east wall for the 6 months I'd lived in this cramped, rent-controlled apartment above Mrs. Gable's antique shop, was now pushed out at a 45-degree angle, creating a narrow, awkward corridor between it and the door. Dust motes danced in the shaft of morning light where the wall had been exposed, revealing decades of grime and a faint, yellowed outline of where the bookshelf had once stood. My skin prickled. I hadn't touched it. I'd barely even looked at it that day, buried under a mountain of freelance design work. I shoved it back with a grunt, the wood scraping harshly against the old floorboards, my heart thudding a little faster than it should have. "Old building," I muttered aloud, the sound unnervingly loud in the silent apartment. "Settling." But buildings don't settle by precisely repositioning heavy furniture into geometrically awkward arrangements. Logic, my usual refuge, began to feel flimsy. The next incident shattered any remaining illusion of coincidence. I came home late after a frustrating client meeting, dumped my bag by the door, and collapsed onto the sofa. It was positioned parallel to the long wall, facing the small kitchenette. I fell into a fitful sleep, the glow of my laptop screen casting long shadows. I woke hours later, stiff and cold, to complete darkness. I fumbled for the lamp on the side table and knocked it over. It clattered to the floor, the bulb shattering. Cursing, I switched on the main light. The sofa wasn't on the long wall. It was in the center of the room, perfectly centered, and it wasn't facing the kitchen anymore. It was facing the apartment's only door, the door that led out to the hallway and the rickety stairs down to Mrs. Gable's shop. My breath hitched. The angle was deliberate, almost confrontational. It felt like a sentry post, a silent observer waiting for someone or something to enter. The empty space where it had been felt like a wound in the room's familiar layout. A cold dread, deeper than mere annoyance, settled in my gut. This wasn't settling. This was intention. I spent the next day researching. The apartment building, a 3-story brick structure squatting on the corner of Elm and 5th, was over a century old. Mrs. Gable, a tiny woman with eyes like chips of obsidian who smelled perpetually of lavender and dust, had owned it since the 70s. When I asked her casually over a cup of weak tea, she insisted I drink while picking up a package she'd held for me about the building's history. She clammed up instantly. Her knuckles whitened around her teacup. "Old places have their ways, dear," she'd said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Best not to pry. Best just to live in it." She refused to elaborate, her gaze dark nervously towards the ceiling, towards my apartment. The look in her eyes wasn't just superstition, it was fear. That night, I decided to fight back. I dragged the sofa back to its rightful place with furious, trembling energy. I positioned the armchair just so. I even placed a small, heavy vase of dried flowers on the coffee table right in the center. A marker, a challenge. "Move this, and I'll know it's real." I went to bed, exhausted, leaving the main light on, a pathetic attempt at warding off the unknown. I woke to darkness again. The main light had been switched off. The vase of dried flowers was gone, not knocked over, not moved to another surface. Gone, vanished. The sofa was back in the center of the room facing the door. The armchair was tucked neatly into the far corner facing the wall, as if in shame or punishment. And on the coffee table, where the vase had been, sat a single object. My old, battered copy of The Catcher in the Rye. I hadn't touched that book in years. It had been buried in a cardboard box labeled Misk Books in the back of my tiny closet. The ghost hadn't just rearranged the furniture. It had gone into my private space, my stored memories, and chosen a book. Placed it deliberately on the table. Why? Was it a message, a threat, or just tidying? Panic, cold and sharp, began to replace the dread. This wasn't just about space anymore. It was about me. My things, my history, my sanctuary was being violated on a fundamental level. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie in bed, every creak of the old building, every sigh of the ancient pipes sounding like the scrape of chair legs on wood. I'd drift off, only to jerk awake hours later, convinced I'd heard the soft, deliberate thump of furniture being shifted. My eyes would snap open, straining in the darkness, searching for the familiar silhouette of the sofa, only to find it wrong, always subtly, insidiously wrong. The rearrangements grew more complex, more personal. One morning I found all my shoes neatly lined up just inside the front door, pairs perfectly matched, laces tucked. Another day, every framed photograph on my walls had been turned to face the wall. My spice rack, usually a chaotic jumble above the stove, was organized alphabetically. My coffee mugs, which lived in a specific cabinet, were arranged by size on the counter. It was cleaning, organizing, but with a chilling, impersonal precision that felt utterly alien. It wasn't helpful. It was corrective. As if my own chaotic existence was an offense to the ghost's sense of order. The worst was the bed. I woke one morning to find it pushed flush against the wall shared with the vacant apartment next door. Not the usual headboard against wall position. The entire side of the bed was pressed flat against the plaster. Getting in and out required climbing over the footboard. It felt like being pinned, trapped. I spent hours that day wrestling it back, my muscles screaming, sweat stinging my eyes, fueled by a rage that bordered on hysteria. "Leave me alone!" I shouted into the empty apartment, my voice cracking. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with an unspoken answer. I started sleeping with the lights on, all of them. The overhead, the lamps, even the tiny nightlight in the bathroom. The electricity bill would be astronomical. But the darkness felt like an accomplice. In the harsh, unblinking glare, the apartment felt safer, more solid. The furniture stayed put. For 3 nights, blessed stillness. Maybe the light was a deterrent. Maybe it was just coincidence. Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered. Then came the night the lights went out. It wasn't a power failure. The street lights outside still cast their orange glow through the grimy window. It was the apartment's lights. One by one they clicked off. The overhead light first, then the reading lamp by the sofa, then the lamp on my dresser. Click, click, click. In the sudden, relative gloom, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with terror, and switched on the flashlight app. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes swirling in the air. The sofa was gone, not moved. Gone. The space where it should have been was empty. The armchair was gone too. The coffee table, the bookshelf, all my major furniture had vanished, leaving only the bed, the dresser, and the kitchen table and chairs. The room felt cavernous, hollowed out. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. Where? Where did it go? I swept the flashlight beam around the room. Nothing, just bare floorboards and empty space. Then the beam caught something on the far wall opposite the door. Words, scratched into the peeling paint, deep and jagged, as if carved with frantic, desperate fingernails. 3 words, stay in bed. The command, raw and primal, sent a wave of pure terror through me. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order from something that knew I was awake, something that was watching, something that controlled the very walls of my home. I froze, the phone trembling in my hand, the beam fixed on those awful words. The silence was absolute, thick enough to choke on. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, the frantic thud of my heart. Slowly, deliberately, a sound began. From the hallway outside, my apartment door. The soft, rhythmic creak, creak, creak of something heavy being dragged across the floorboards, pausing, then dragging again. It stopped right outside my door. The brass knob turned slowly, silently. The door swung inwards on well-oiled hinges I hadn't known existed. The hallway light was off, but the street light outside the building's main entrance cast a long, distorted shadow into my room. A shadow of something large, impossibly large. And within that shadow, 2 points of faint, sickly yellow light glowed where eyes should be. It didn't step inside. It just stood there, filling the doorway, radiating a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. A cold that seeped into my bones, into the marrow of my fear. The dragging sound started again, but this time it was coming from inside my apartment, from the direction of the vacant rooms beyond my bedroom wall. The sound of furniture being pulled back into place, slowly, deliberately, as if setting the stage. The shadow in the doorway didn't move. It just watched. Those yellow eyes fixed on me where I stood, paralyzed, next to my bed. The message was clear, colder than the deepest winter. You can rearrange it. I will put it back, and I will watch you while I do. I don't sleep with the lights off anymore. I don't sleep much at all. I sit in the center of the room on the floor, my back against the cold plaster of the wall farthest from the door, a baseball bat across my knees. The furniture is back. Everything is in its proper place, the way the ghost prefers. The sofa facing the door like a sentinel, the armchair tucked away, the bed pushed tight against the shared wall. I haven't touched anything. I eat standing up at the kitchen counter. I shower with the bathroom light blazing, jumping at every drip of the faucet. Mrs. Gable hasn't spoken to me since I asked about the building. She just gives me wary, pitying looks when I pass her on the stairs, clutching my groceries like a shield. She knows. She's always known. Sometimes, in the dead silence of 3 a.m., I hear it. Not dragging anymore, something softer, a faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tapping. Like fingernails, gentle, patient, tapping against the inside of the wall shared with the vacant apartment. Right where my head rests on the pillow when I'm forced, by sheer exhaustion, to risk lying down. It's not trying to get in. It's reminding me it's there, that it's waiting, that this apartment isn't mine. It never was. It belongs to the one who rearranges the furniture, who organizes the chaos, who enforces its silent, suffocating order. And it has decided I am part of the furniture now, something to be positioned, managed, controlled. The tapping continues, steady, inexorable, like a clock counting down the seconds until I finally move just an inch out of place. The night grows deeper as we leave this story behind and move on to the next. The hotel clerk gave me room 13, then whispered, "Don't answer if it knocks twice." Rain lashed against the windshield as I pulled into the gravel lot of the Blackwood Inn just past midnight, the wipers struggling to keep pace with the downpour. The GPS had rerouted me 3 times thanks to washed-out back roads, and what should have been a 4-hour drive from the city had stretched into 7 hours of white-knuckle navigating through storm-slicked mountain passes. My eyes burned with exhaustion, my neck stiff from hours hunched over the steering wheel. The Blackwood Inn wasn't my intended stop. It hadn't even been on my original route. But when the last gas station attendant warned me about the bridge out ahead and pointed toward the flickering neon vacancy sign in the distance, I didn't hesitate. Any roof was better than none. The lobby was dimly lit and smelled of mildew and old wood smoke. A single bulb hung above the check-in desk, casting long shadows across peeling floral wallpaper. Behind the counter stood a man who looked as weathered as the building itself, deep lines carved around his eyes, hair more silver than gray, fingers stained yellow from decades of cigarettes, though no ashtray was visible. He didn't look up as I approached, his attention fixed on a ledger open before him, pen scratching slowly across the page. "Room for the night?" I asked, my voice rough from disuse. He nodded without speaking, still writing. When he finally set the pen down, he slid a brass key across the counter toward me. It was cold and heavy, the number 13 stamped into its head. "Room 13, he said, his voice a dry rasp like stones grinding together. "End of the hall on the left." I reached for the key, but before my fingers could close around it, his hand shot out and gripped my wrist. His skin was papery thin, surprisingly strong. He leaned forward, his breath smelling faintly of peppermint and something else, something metallic like old blood. His eyes, pale blue and unnervingly sharp, locked onto mine. "Don't answer if it knocks twice," he whispered, so low I almost missed it over the drumming rain outside. Then he released my wrist and stepped back, his expression shut and closed, as if the moment had never happened. "Checkout's at 11. I stood there for a second, stunned, the words echoing in my skull. Don't answer if it knocks twice. Not someone. It. Before I could ask what he meant, he'd turned away, busying himself with the ledger again, effectively dismissing me. My exhaustion warred with a prickle of unease, but logic won out. Old hotels had quirks, superstitious staff, probably just a local ghost story he told all the guests for kicks. I pocketed the key and headed for the stairs. The hallway on the second floor was narrow and poorly lit, the carpet threadbare and damp underfoot. Room 13 was exactly where he'd said. End of the hall, door painted a chipped black that seemed to absorb the weak light from the single fixture overhead. The key turned with a gritty resistance, the lock protesting decades of use. Inside the room was smaller than I expected, but clean enough. A narrow bed with a faded quilt, a scarred wooden dresser, a single armchair by the window overlooking the storm-ravaged parking lot. The air smelled stale but not unpleasant, like old books and lemon polish. I dropped my duffel bag by the door and collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, too tired to care about sheets or pajamas. Sleep hit me like a physical blow. I woke to darkness and silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness that pressed against the windows like a held breath. My phone read 2:47 a.m. I needed to pee. As I swung my legs off the bed, I heard it, a knock at the door, soft, polite. 3 quick raps. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour? Housekeeping? Unlikely. Another guest? Possible, but why my room? I stayed silent, listening. After a full minute of quiet, I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Shrugging it off as a dream fragment bleeding into wakefulness, I used the bathroom down the hall and returned to my room, locking the deadbolt this time. I was drifting back to sleep when I heard it again. Knock, knock. 2 raps, deliberate, measured, exactly 2 seconds apart. My blood turned to ice. Don't answer if it knocks twice. I lay perfectly still in the dark, every muscle locked, my breath shallow and silent. The knocking didn't repeat. No doorknob rattled, no voice called out. Just silence, stretching taut and thin. After 10 minutes, I allowed myself to relax slightly. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the old pipes groaning, maybe my own imagination conjuring horrors from exhaustion. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I noticed something I hadn't before. Above the bed, centered perfectly on the water-stained plaster, someone had scratched a series of symbols into the wall. Not graffiti. These were precise, almost ritualistic. A circle bisected by a vertical line, surrounded by 7 smaller dots arranged in a crescent shape. Beneath them, carved so deeply the plaster dust had collected in the grooves, were the numbers. 13. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I packed my bag quickly and headed downstairs to settle my bill. The lobby was empty, except for a young woman wiping down the front desk with a rag that looked dirtier than the surface it was cleaning. She smiled brightly when she saw me. "Checking out already? You barely slept." "Yeah, well, long drive ahead," I said, forcing a smile. "Listen, about room 13. Is there anything I should know? The clerk last night, he said something strange about knocking." Her smile faltered. She glanced toward the back office, then lowered her voice. "Old man Hargrove, he's superstitious. Pays attention to things most folks don't." She leaned closer, her eyes darting nervously. "Room 13's always been odd. Guests complain about noises, cold spots. One woman swore she saw a figure standing in the corner watching her sleep. But the real trouble started after Eleanor." "Eleanor?" She nodded, twisting the rag in her hands. "Eleanor Voss. Stayed in room 13 back in '89. Never checked out. They found her 3 days later dead in the bed. Heart failure, they said. But," she hesitated, "but the coroner's report mentioned something weird. Her hands were clenched so tight around the bed sheets they had to pry her fingers loose, and her eyes, they said her eyes were fixed on the door like she'd seen something terrifying right before she died." A chill crawled up my spine. "Did they ever figure out what she saw?" The girl shook her head. "No, but after that, guests started reporting knocks at the door, always 2 knocks, and if they answered, She trailed off, her face paling. 3 people disappeared from that room over the next decade, just vanished. Left all their stuff behind. Suitcases unzipped, wallets on the dresser. The police stopped investigating after a while. Said it was coincidence. But old man Hargrove, he knows. That's why he tells people not to answer if it knocks twice. I left the Blackwood Inn without looking back, the image of those carved symbols burning in my mind. I drove straight to the county records office in the nearest town, spending the afternoon digging through archived newspapers and death certificates. What I found chilled me deeper than any ghost story. Eleanor Voss hadn't just died of heart failure, she'd been running. From what? The records didn't say. She'd checked into the Blackwood Inn under a false name, paid cash for a week's stay, and kept to herself. The night she died, the only other guest in the hotel was a man registered as J. Smith, a name so common it was meaningless. He'd checked out the morning after Eleanor's body was discovered, leaving no forwarding address. But the real revelation came from a microfiche article buried in a 1990 issue of the local paper, a follow-up piece mentioning that Eleanor Voss had been a historian specializing in Appalachian folk magic. Her final research project, according to colleagues, involved protective sigils used to ward off entities that mimic human behavior to gain entry to homes. The symbols above my bed, the circle, the line, the 7 dots, matched descriptions from her unpublished notes. A ward, a desperate, last-minute attempt to protect herself. That night, safe in a chain motel 50 miles away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I double-checked the locks, pushed a chair under the doorknob, and slept with the lights on. But at 2:47 a.m., I woke to the sound of rain against a window and 2 soft knocks at the door. Knock. Knock. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knocking didn't repeat. But when I checked the peephole, the hallway was empty, except for a single, waterlogged business card lying on the carpet. I didn't pick it up. I knew what it would say. Blackwood Inn. Vacancy. I moved cities after that. Changed my number. Avoided old hotels, especially ones with flickering neon signs. But sometimes, on rainy nights when the power flickers and the house settles into silence, I hear it again. 2 knocks, polite, patient, waiting. And I remember old man Hargrove's grip on my wrist, his breath smelling of peppermint and old blood, his pale eyes boring into mine as he whispered the warning that saved my life. Don't answer if it knocks twice. Because whatever knocked on my door that night in room 13 wasn't human. It was something that learned from its mistakes. Something that realized doors can be opened from the inside if you just convince the occupant to invite you in. And now wherever I go, it follows. Not as a shadow or a specter, but as a possibility, a knock in the dark, a choice waiting to be made. I never answer, not once, not ever. But I wonder sometimes how long it will keep trying, how many doors it will knock on before it finds someone who doesn't know the rule, someone who, in their loneliness or curiosity or simple exhaustion, turns the knob and lets it in. And I wonder what it does to them after that. And with that, this story is over. Now, a new story begins. I took a night shift in a haunted hotel where no one books room 9. I needed the money. Desperately. After the layoff at the call center, the one where they called it restructuring but really just handed us pink slips and a lukewarm donut on the way out. I'd cycled through temp gigs that barely covered gas, let alone rent. So when old man Hargrove, the owner of the Everly Grand Hotel, offered me the night clerk position over lukewarm coffee at the diner, I didn't ask why the last guy quit after only 3 shifts. I just nodded and said, "When do I start?" The Everly Grand wasn't grand anymore. It was a hulking relic of the 1920s, wedged between a shuttered laundromat and a pawn shop on the edge of downtown. Once, it had hosted jazz-age celebrities and politicians. Now, it catered mostly to truckers passing through and the occasional couple looking for a cheap place to hide a hangover. The lobby still had marble floors and tarnished brass fixtures, but the carpet was worn threadbare in paths worn by decades of weary feet, and the chandeliers flickered with the erratic heartbeat of failing bulbs. Hargrove, gaunt and stooped in a moth-eaten cardigan, gave me the bare minimum tour. "Front desk is yours from midnight to 6, he rasped, his voice like gravel under a boot. "Guests check in before 11. Mostly just 3, 5, and 7 on the second floor get used. Room 12 on the third sometimes. Rest are storage." He paused outside a door on the second floor hallway, his knuckles whitening around the cane he leaned on. His eyes darted toward the door marked with a tarnished brass 9. "Room 9, he said, voice dropping to a whisper, "is not to be entered, not by guests, not by staff, not ever. You see the lock? Keep it locked. If someone asks for it, tell 'em it's flooded, or under renovation, or full of bees. Anything. Just don't let them in, and don't go in yourself." He wouldn't say why, just shook his head, muttered about old business, and shuffled off, leaving me standing in the dim corridor, with the weight of that single locked door pressing against my back. My first night was quiet, eerily so. The hotel was empty, except for a trucker snoring in room 3. I sat at the scarred wooden desk, under the weak glow of a green-shaded lamp, reading a dog-eared paperback and jumping at every creak of the old building settling. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, soft at first, like water dripping, but the sound wasn't coming from the pipes. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Click, click, click. Like high heels on hardwood. I froze, listening. It seemed to come from the hallway outside the front desk. Near the staircase leading up to the second floor, I grabbed the heavy flashlight from under the desk, more for comfort than utility, and crept to the archway. The hallway was empty. The carpet muffled sound, but the click, click, click was still there, faint now, drifting from somewhere upstairs. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Hello?" I called out, my voice too loud in the silence. Nothing answered, just the dripping sound, retreating further away until it vanished entirely. I chalked it up to nerves. Old buildings make noises. Rats, maybe, or wind finding its way through cracks I couldn't see. I went back to my desk, but sleep was impossible. Every shadow in the lobby seemed to shift. Every tick of the grandfather clock behind me felt like a countdown. The second night, things escalated. Around 1 a.m., the fire alarm blared, a short, sharp shriek that cut through the silence like a knife. I scrambled to the panel behind the desk. No smoke, no heat sensors triggered, just the alarm wailing insistently for 30 seconds before cutting off as abruptly as it started. My hands were shaking as I checked the system log. Nothing. Blank. Like it had never happened. Then at 3:17 a.m., the phone on the desk rang. I nearly fell off my stool. No one ever called the front desk at night. Guests used the room phone if they needed anything, and there was no one else in the building. I let it ring 3 times before picking up, my throat dry. "Everly Grand, how can I—" Static hissed down the line. Then a voice, female, young, terrified. "Help me, please. I can't get out. The door, it won't open." The words were choked, punctuated by ragged breathing. "Room 9. I'm in room 9. My blood went cold. "Room 9 is locked," I stammered. "No one's in there. It's not occupied." "It is now," she sobbed. I walked in. I don't know how. It was open, and now it's locked from the outside. Please, the mirrors, they're watching me." The line went dead. I sat frozen, the receiver clutched in my hand, the dial tone buzzing mockingly in my ear. It couldn't be real. It had to be a prank. But the voice, it had been so raw, so genuinely panicked. And the mention of mirrors. Hargrove hadn't said anything about mirrors. I spent the rest of the night staring at the staircase, half expecting to see that girl stumble down, pale and wide-eyed. Nothing happened. At 6 a.m., when Hargrove shuffled in for his morning coffee, I blurted out the story. He didn't look surprised, just weary. "Told you," he said, stirring sugar into his mug with a trembling hand. "Room 9 doesn't take kindly to callers or guests or questions." He wouldn't say more. The third night, I brought my phone. Not for calls. Reception was spotty in the lobby, but to record anything strange, maybe proof, maybe just for my own sanity. The hotel felt heavier that night, the air thick and stale, like it hadn't been breathed in years. Around midnight, the temperature in the lobby dropped suddenly. My breath fogged in front of me. The green lamp flickered, casting long, leaping shadows. Then the piano in the sunken parlor, a grand, dust-covered instrument I hadn't even noticed before, began to play. Not a full song, just a single melancholic note. Held. Then another. Slow, hesitant, like someone learning or remembering. I crept toward the archway, phone held out, recording. The parlor was dark, moonlight streaming through tall, grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The piano bench was empty, but the keys were moving, depressing slowly, one by an invisible hand. I stopped recording. My hands were icy. This wasn't rats. This wasn't the wind. This was something else, something that knew I was watching. I retreated to the desk, locking the parlor door from my side, a flimsy lock, but it made me feel marginally safer. Hours crawled by. Just before 4 a.m., I heard the click, click, click again. Closer this time, right outside the front desk archway. I held my breath, peering into the gloom. A figure stood there. She was tall, dressed in a pale, old-fashioned nightgown that might have been white once, but was now stained, yellow with age. Her hair was long and dark, hanging in wet strands around a face that was pale as bone. But it was her eyes that froze me, wide, black, and utterly empty. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking through me, at something beyond. Water dripped from the hem of a gown, pooling on the worn carpet. Click, click, click. Her bare feet made no sound, but the dripping continued, rhythmic as a metronome. She turned slowly, her head tilting at an unnatural angle, and looked directly at me. A smile touched her lips, a thin, humorless curve. Then she raised a hand, pale and dripping, and pointed toward the staircase, toward the second floor, toward room 9. She vanished. Not like she walked away. One moment she was there, the next, the space was empty, only the damp spot on the carpet remaining. I didn't sleep for the rest of the shift. I sat rigid at the desk, every muscle clenched, jumping at the slightest sound. When dawn finally bled through the lobby. Windows! I packed up my things and walked straight to Hargrove's office. I told him I quit. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about the rent. I'd rather sleep under a bridge. Hargrove just sighed, rubbing his temples. "Figured you would," he said. "They always do." He pulled a folder from a drawer and slid it across the desk. "Before you go, maybe you should know." He tapped the folder. Her name was Elise Werner, stayed at the Everly Grand in 1931, young actress, supposed to be in some big picture, checked into room 9, was found dead 2 days later, drowned in her bathtub, only there was no water in the tub, not a drop. Coroner called it unexplained. He paused, his eyes distant. They say she was heartbroken, waiting for a lover who never came. That last night, she paced the hallway in her nightgown, dripping wet from a bath she'd taken, waiting. And when he didn't show, she just stopped waiting. But her body wouldn't stay dry, and her spirit, it won't stop pacing, won't stop waiting, and if anyone goes into room 9, she thinks they're him, and she won't let them leave. I stared at the folder, at the grainy black and white photo of a smiling, vibrant young woman with bright eyes. Nothing like the hollow thing I'd seen. "Why doesn't anyone book it?" I whispered. "Because no one sane would," Hargrove said simply. "And the ones who do, they never check out." I left the Everly Grand that morning, the weight of the place clinging to me like damp. I found another job, washing dishes in a greasy spoon diner, slept with the lights on for weeks. Thought I was free. Then last night, my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Static. Then that voice, not panic this time, calm, certain. "You left," it said, "but you saw me. You know where I am. Room 9 is waiting. The door, it's open now, just for you." The line went dead. I checked my phone. No missed call, no history, just the time, 3:33 a.m. And outside my window, 3 blocks away, I could just make out the silhouette of the Everly Grand against the pre-dawn sky. A single light burned in a second-floor window. Room 9. The phone in my hand vibrated. A text from an unknown number. Just 2 words. "Come home." And that's where this story ends. Let's move on to the next one. The reflection in my bedroom mirror started blinking on its own. I should have known something was wrong the moment Mrs. Gable handed me the key. Her fingers were dry and papery, trembling slightly as she pressed the tarnished brass into my palm. The key was cold, unnaturally so for a humid August afternoon, and it left a damp spot on my skin that didn't fade for minutes afterward. She wouldn't meet my eyes, not once during the entire transaction, and when I asked about the previous tenant, her lips tightened into a thin white line before she muttered something about moving south for the weather and practically shoved the lease papers at me. But I was desperate. My savings had evaporated after the layoff, and this place, a converted Victorian on the edge of town, divided into 4 apartments, was the only option within my budget. $300 a month for a private entrance, a bedroom, a tiny kitchenette, and my own bathroom. It seemed impossible, too good to be true, which should have been my first warning. The realtor's listing had been vague about the building's history, mentioning only that it was full of character and historically significant. I'd been too focused on the price to wonder why a place with so much space rented for less than a studio apartment downtown. The first week was uneventful. I moved my sparse belongings into the ground floor unit, a bedroom that might have once been a parlor with tall ceilings and ornate crown molding blackened with age. The previous tenant had left behind a few things: a threadbare armchair in the corner, a small writing desk with a warped surface, and, most notably, an enormous floor-length mirror framed in tarnished silver that stood against the far wall opposite the bed. I'd planned to move it out, but it was heavier than it looked, impossibly so, as if its roots had grown deep into the floorboards. After straining my shoulder trying to budge it, I gave up and decided I could live with it. Mirrors weren't exactly on my list of phobias. At the time, I thought it added a touch of elegance to the otherwise barren room. The trouble began subtly, as these things often do. I'd catch movement in the mirror's periphery when I knew I was alone. A flicker where nothing should be. I chalked it up to fatigue, to the stress of unemployment, to the unfamiliar shadows cast by streetlights filtering through the gauzy curtains I'd hung over the tall windows. I'd turn quickly, heart hammering, only to find the room empty and still. The rational part of my brain, the part that had earned a degree in engineering and believed firmly in cause and effect, dismissed these incidents as tricks of the light, as my mind filling in blanks during moments of distraction. Then came the blinking. It happened on a Tuesday night, just past midnight. I'd been lying in bed scrolling through job listings on my phone, the blue light casting a sickly glow across the room. Exhausted but unable to sleep, I finally set the phone aside and rolled onto my back, staring at the ceiling. The mirror stood directly across from me, reflecting the dim outline of my bed, the shape of my body beneath the sheets. Out of habit, my eyes drifted toward it, the way people glance at clocks or check their reflections without conscious thought, and that's when I saw it. My reflection was looking back at me, but I wasn't looking at the ceiling. My mirrored self had turned its head slightly on the pillow, its eyes open and fixed directly on mine, and then slowly, deliberately, it blinked. Once. A full, languid closing and opening of the eyelids. Not the quick, involuntary blink of a living person, but something measured and intentional. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move a muscle, terrified that any motion might confirm what I was seeing, or worse, provoke it. I stared at my reflection, waiting. Seconds stretched into a minute. My actual eyes began to burn with the strain of not blinking, tears gathering at the corners. Finally, unable to bear it, I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, then opened them again. The reflection was normal. It mirrored my current position exactly. Staring wide-eyed at the ceiling, body rigid with tension, I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. A trick of the mind, sleep deprivation, stress, hallucination. I recited these explanations like a mantra, forcing myself to roll onto my side, facing away from the mirror. I didn't sleep much that night. The next evening, I decided to test it. After dinner, I sat on the edge of my bed, facing the mirror directly, and simply watched my reflection. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. I waved my hand. The reflection waved back. I stuck out my tongue. It mimicked me perfectly. I stood up, walked to the door, turned off the light, and stood in darkness for a full minute before switching it back on. The reflection did exactly what I did. I felt foolish, embarrassed, even. I genuinely frightened myself over nothing. Relieved, I prepared for bed, brushing my teeth in the small bathroom down the hall. When I returned to the bedroom, I toweled off my face and glanced at the mirror without thinking. My reflection was already looking at me. I hadn't turned toward the mirror yet. I was still facing the doorway, my back partially turned. But in the glass, my reflection stood fully facing forward, towel in hand, its head tilted slightly to the left. Its eyes were open wide, unblinking. And then, as I stood paralyzed in the doorway, it smiled. Not my smile. This was a thin, stretched thing that didn't reach the eyes. A smile of possession, of quiet triumph. I stumbled backward, crashing into the doorframe, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. I fumbled for the light switch, plunging the room into darkness, and didn't dare move until sunrise painted pale stripes across the floorboards. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the armchair in the corner, as far from the mirror as possible, wrapped in a blanket despite the summer heat, jumping at every creak of the old house settling. By morning, rationality began to reassert itself. Sleep deprivation, waking nightmares bleeding into consciousness. The human mind is suggestible, especially when isolated and stressed. I made coffee, showered with the bathroom door locked, and forced myself to look at the mirror in daylight. It was just a mirror. An old, slightly warped piece of glass in a tarnished frame, nothing more. But the fear had taken root. I started avoiding the mirror altogether. I changed clothes in the bathroom. I brushed my teeth with my back to it. I arranged my few possessions to partially block its view from the bed. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting superstition override logic, but the memory of that smile, the wrongness of it, haunted me. I began researching the house online during the day, digging through local archives and historical society records when I should have been applying for jobs. What I found unsettled me further. The house had been built in 1892 by a wealthy industrialist named Alastair Finch for his young bride, Eleanor. The marriage was reportedly unhappy. Alastair was frequently away on business, and Eleanor lived in isolation with only servants for company. In 1897, at age 24, Eleanor Finch was found dead in her bedroom. The official cause was listed as hysterical paralysis of the heart, a Victorian euphemism for what we'd now call a panic attack or cardiac event brought on by extreme distress. But the coroner's report, which I managed to access through a digitized archive, contained a curious notation. The victim's eyes were described as fixed in a state of perpetual terror, and her hands were clenched so tightly around the bed sheets that attendants had to pry her fingers loose post-mortem. More intriguing was a footnote mentioning that a large, silver-framed mirror had been removed from the bedroom at the family's request before the body was taken away. The mirror's current whereabouts were unrecorded. I also discovered that my particular unit had seen an unusual number of short-term tenants over the past 2 decades. None had stayed longer than 6 months. Several listings mentioned the mirror specifically. Previous renters had tried to remove it, but work orders noted it was affixed to the wall structure in an unconventional manner, and attempts to move it had resulted in damage to the floorboards beneath. One tenant from 2008 had left a scathing review on an old rental site. Mirror in bedroom is creepy, feels watched. Landlord refused to remove it, moved out after 3 weeks. I should have left then. Packed my bags and slept in my car if I had to. But pride and financial desperation held me in place. I'd signed a 6-month lease. Breaking it would cost me the deposit I couldn't afford to lose. And part of me, the stubborn, rational part, refused to be chased out by what was probably just an overactive imagination fueled by historical coincidence. That was my second mistake. The incidents escalated. I began waking in the night to the sound of soft weeping coming from the direction of the mirror. Not loud sobbing, but a quiet, desolate crying that seemed to seep from the glass itself. I'd lie frozen in bed, listening until the sound faded, telling myself it was the wind or pipes or my own mind conjuring horrors from silence. One night, I woke to find the temperature in the room had dropped precipitously. My breath fogged in the air, though it was 75 degrees outside. And in the mirror, my reflection lay sleeping peacefully while I was wide awake, staring in horror at the glass. My sleeping reflection turned its head toward me and whispered something I couldn't hear. But I saw the shape of the words form on its lips. Almost time. I started sleeping with the covers over my head. Childish, I know, but it was the only thing that offered a shred of comfort. I avoided the bedroom entirely during the day, spending my waking hours at the public library or walking through parks, returning home only when exhaustion forced me to face the night. I stopped looking at the mirror altogether, keeping my gaze fixed on the floor or the opposite wall whenever I had to be in the room. I even considered covering it with a sheet, but something, a deep, instinctual dread, prevented me from approaching it closely enough to drape fabric over the glass. The breaking point came on a rain-swept Thursday night. Thunder rolled in the distance as I lay in bed, covers pulled to my chin, back to the mirror. I'd been lying there for hours, listening to the rain patter against the windows, trying to will myself into unconsciousness. Sleep had become a battleground I was steadily losing. Then I heard it, a soft tapping sound, not from the window, from the mirror. Tap, 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 like fingernails gently, rapping against glass. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the blanket tighter. It's the rain, I told myself. Rain hitting the window, echoing strangely in the old house. But the rhythm was wrong, too deliberate, too patterned. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. My entire body went rigid, every muscle locked. I could feel the weight of its attention pressing against my back, a physical pressure like cold water trickling down my spine. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was only the sound of rain and my own ragged breathing. Then a new sound began, a slow, wet, dragging noise, like something heavy, being pulled across a floor. It came from the direction of the mirror. It moved toward the foot of my bed, stopped, then began climbing, the sound of fabric or flesh scraping against bedposts, inching upward along the footboard. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. A paralysis had seized me, deeper than fear, a primal shutdown where even the instinct to flee had been extinguished. I felt the mattress dip at the foot of the bed. A presence settled there, heavy and cold. The air grew frigid, my breath pluming visibly in the moonlight, filtering through the curtains. Something leaned close to my ear. I felt the brush of cold air against my skin, smelled the faint scent of old roses and damp earth. And then a voice, so close it seemed to come from inside my own skull, whispered a single word. Eleanor. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember running. But I found myself standing in the hallway outside my apartment door, barefoot and shivering in my pajamas, rain soaking through my clothes from where I must have stumbled outside in my panic. I stood there for 20 minutes in the downpour before I could force myself to go back inside. The room was empty. The bed was undisturbed. The mirror stood silent and still in the corner, reflecting only the moonlit room and my own terrified face. But on the foot of the bed, clear and unmistakable on the rumpled duvet cover, were two faint, damp impressions, the shape of small, bare feet. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I spent Friday morning on the phone with Mrs. Gable, demanding the mirror be removed immediately. Her voice turned brittle when I mentioned Eleanor Finch. That mirror has been in that room for over a century, she said, her tone shifting from polite landlord to something harder, defensive. It's part of the property. You knew the condition of the unit when you signed the lease. It's not safe, I insisted, my voice shaking. Something is wrong with it. I'm not imagining things. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice was low, almost pitying. Every tenant says that eventually. They all see things, hear things. The mirror. It shows you what you need to see or what you fear most. Eleanor Finch didn't die of fright, you know. She went mad staring into that glass. Convinced her reflection had developed a will of its own, started sleeping with her back to it. Then she claimed it was getting out at night. Mrs. Gable sighed. The official story was hysteria, but the servants who found her, they said the mirror was warm to the touch, and that for 3 days after her death, if you looked into it at midnight, you could see her still lying in bed, eyes open, watching the door. Why would you rent a room with something like that in it? I demanded, horror warring with outrage. Because it's just a mirror, she said flatly. It's glass and silvering and old wood. What happens in front of it, that's between you and whatever you carry inside yourself. The mirror doesn't create the horror. It just reflects what's already there. She refused to remove it, refused to let me break the lease without penalty. I was trapped. That night, I made a decision. I would confront it. I would sit before the mirror and face whatever was happening head on. Running hadn't worked. Avoidance hadn't worked. Maybe acknowledgement would break whatever hold it had over me. It was a desperate gamble, but I was out of options. I couldn't live like this, jumping at shadows, afraid to sleep in my own bed. I waited till midnight. I dragged the armchair to face the mirror directly, sat down, and turned on the single lamp beside the bed. The warm light filled the room, pushing back the shadows. My reflection stared back at me, pale-faced, dark circles under my eyes, hair disheveled. I looked like a ghost already. Okay, I said aloud, my voice trembling despite my resolve. I'm here. Show me what you want me to see. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. My reflection mimicked my every micro-expression. The slight tightening of my lips, the blink of dry eyes, the nervous tap of my fingers on the armrest. I began to feel foolish again. Maybe Mrs. Gable was right. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I'd finally cracked under the pressure of unemployment and isolation. Then my reflection stopped. Blinking, I continued to blink normally, every few seconds, an involuntary reflex. But in the mirror, my reflected eyes remained wide open, unblinking, staring directly at me with an intensity that felt alien. A minute passed. 2. My eyes began to burn and water, but the reflection's eyes stayed dry and clear. And then slowly, deliberately, the reflection smiled. That same thin, possessive smile I'd seen before. It raised its hand, the left hand, and pressed its palm against the inside of the glass. I didn't move my own hand. My body remained perfectly still in the chair. But in the mirror, my reflection's hand flattened against the silvered surface. Fingers splayed, and the glass began to ripple, not like water, more like heat haze on a summer road, a distortion that warped the reflection's features. The silver frame seemed to darken, the tarnish spreading like mold across the ornate scrollwork. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath fogged thickly in the air. I tried to stand up, to run, but my limbs refused to obey. I was locked in place, forced to watch as the reflection's hand pushed forward and a glass bulged outward, stretching like taffy around its fingers. A sound emerged from the mirror, not a sound heard with ears, but one that vibrated directly in my skull, a low, wet, tearing noise like fabric ripping or skin parting. The reflection's face contorted, its smile widening until the corners of its mouth split at the edges, dark lines spreading like cracks in porcelain. Its eyes, my eyes, rolled back until only the white showed, then snapped forward again, now completely black. It mouthed words I could read perfectly despite the distortion. "Let me out." The glass bulged further. The reflection's arm was now halfway through the mirror. The sleeve of its pajama top stretched taut around a forearm that was no longer quite mine. Paler, thinner, the bones too prominent beneath skin that seemed stretched too tight. The fingers curled, beckoning. Terror finally broke the paralysis. I screamed, a raw, ragged sound, and threw myself backward, chair and all, crashing onto the floor. I scrambled on hands and knees toward the bedroom door, not daring to look back. I made it into the hallway, slammed my bedroom door shut, and shoved the flimsy dresser in front of it, my entire body shaken with adrenaline and cold. I spent the night on the floor of the tiny living area, back against the front door, knife clutched in my hand. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shift of shadow sent fresh waves of panic through me. But the bedroom door remained closed. The mirror didn't follow me. Not that night. At dawn, exhausted and hollow-eyed, I made my decision. I would leave, least be damned. I would pack what I could carry and walk away from the rest. Better to be homeless than to spend another night in that room. I waited until full daylight, until the sun streamed through the front windows and painted the hallway in gold. Steeling myself, I approached the bedroom door. The dresser was exactly as I'd left it. I listened at the door for a full minute. Silence. Taking a deep breath, I shoved the dresser aside, turned the knob, and pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty, undisturbed. The bed was neatly made. I must have done it in my panic the night before without remembering. The armchair sat in its usual place in the corner, and the mirror was gone, not moved, not covered, gone. In its place stood only a section of slightly discolored wallpaper where the frame had hung for over a century. No marks on the floor, no scuffing on the baseboard, just empty space where an impossibly heavy mirror had stood the night before. I stood there for a long time, staring at the blank wall, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Had I imagined the entire thing? Had sleep deprivation and stress finally broken me completely? I walked slowly into the room, running my hands over the wallpaper where the mirror should have been. Solid wall, no hidden compartments, no tricks. Relief washed over me so powerfully I nearly collapsed. It was over. Whatever had been happening, hallucination, haunting, psychological break, it was finished. The mirror was gone. I was free. I spent the morning packing my essentials into a single duffel bag, moving with a lightness I hadn't felt in weeks. I even hummed as I worked, the tension that had coiled in my shoulders for a month finally releasing. By noon, I was ready to leave. I took one last walk through the apartment, checking that I hadn't forgotten anything important. I stopped in the bedroom doorway for a final look. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The room looked peaceful, almost welcoming. And that's when I saw it. On the wall opposite the bed, the wall where I'd spent every night sleeping with my back to the mirror, was a new mirror. Smaller than the first, oval-shaped with a simple wooden frame, hanging at eye level as if it had always been there. I stared at it, confusion warring with a creeping dread. I had never seen this mirror before. I was certain of it. I'd studied every inch of this room during my weeks of terror. There had been no mirror on this wall. Hesitantly, I stepped closer. My reflection appeared in the glass, pale but calm, duffel bag slung over my shoulder. It mimicked my movements perfectly as I approached. I raised my hand. It raised its hand. I smiled tentatively. It smiled back. And then, as I stood there watching, my reflection's smile slowly faded. Its eyes widened slightly, not with fear, but with recognition, with understanding. It raised its free hand and pointed, not at me, but past me, toward the doorway behind my actual body. I froze. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed not to look away from the glass, but I had to know. Slowly, fighting every fiber of my being, I turned my head to glance over my shoulder at the empty doorway. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was no longer mimicking me. It stood facing forward, eyes fixed on the glass, a look of profound sadness on its face. It brought its hands together in front of its chest, not in prayer, but in a gesture of containment, of holding something precious. And then it began to fade, not vanishing entirely, but becoming translucent, like a photograph left in the sun. Through its fading form, I could see the room behind it, the bed, the window, the empty space where the large mirror had stood. As it faded, its lips moved. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. "Thank you," it whispered, the words forming silently on its lips but echoing clearly in my mind. I needed someone to see me, to witness. Now I can rest. The reflection dissolved completely, leaving only the room behind it visible in the glass. I stood there for a long time, trembling, tears streaming down my face, though I didn't understand why I was crying. The mirror on the wall remained, just an ordinary mirror now, reflecting only what was actually there. I left the apartment an hour later. I didn't look back. I never returned for the rest of my belongings. I walked to the bus station and bought a ticket to the next town over, to a cheap motel with no mirrors in the rooms. It's been 3 months now. I have a new job, a new apartment on the third floor of a modern building with no history and no mirrors in the bedroom. I sleep with the lights on sometimes. I still startle at sudden movements in reflective surfaces, but the nightmares have lessened. The feeling of being watched has faded. Last week, on a whim, I drove back to that town. I didn't go near the Victorian house. Instead, I visited the local cemetery, the one where historical records said the Finch family plot was located. I found it easily, prominent even after all these years. And there, between the graves of Alastair and Eleanor Finch, was a small weathered headstone I hadn't read about in any records. The inscription was nearly worn away by time, but I could just make out the words in the afternoon light. Eleanor's Reflection, 1873 to 1897. Finally at peace, I stood there for a long time, the autumn wind rustling the dry leaves around my feet. I didn't feel fear, not anymore. Just a deep, quiet sorrow for a young woman who had been so profoundly alone that even her own reflection became a separate entity, a companion, a tormentor, a prisoner. And I understood then what Mrs. Gable had meant. The mirror hadn't created the horror. It had simply reflected a loneliness so absolute it had taken on a life of its own. I never told anyone what happened in that room. Who would believe me? But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I think about that final reflection, the sadness in its eyes, the gratitude in its fading form. And I wonder if some prisons aren't made of stone or iron, but of perception, of being seen, truly seen, for the first time after a century of solitude. I still avoid mirrors when I can, but when I must look into one, I make sure to hold my own gaze, to acknowledge the person staring back without flinching, because I learned something in that haunted room, something that stays with me still. Every reflection is a kind of ghost, and every ghost, no matter how terrifying, is just someone waiting to be seen. This is where the story ends. Let's continue with the next. The portrait in the attic changes its expression every night. The inheritance came with keys and caveats. My great-aunt Eleanor's lawyer handed me the deed to Willowwood House, a sprawling shingled Victorian on the edge of a dying New England town, with a handshake that lingered a second too long. "She left it to you specifically," he said, his voice dry as attic dust. "Said you were the only one who'd understand its moods." He wouldn't elaborate, just slid a rusted key across his desk. "The attic door sticks. Use the spare key for it, and whatever you do, don't disturb the portrait on the east wall. It's not yours to touch." When I asked why, he simply adjusted his glasses, the lenses flashing opaque. "Some doors," he murmured, "are best left closed." Willowwood smelled of beeswax and buried time. Sunlight strained through grimy leaded windows, illuminating dust motes dancing above threadbare Persian rugs and velvet drapes heavy with mildew. The air hung still and cold even in late September, carrying the faint, sweet decay of dried roses and old paper. Eleanor had lived alone for 40 years after my grandfather's death, and the silence had seeped into the floorboards, the wainscoting, the very marrow of the house. I moved in on a Tuesday, hauling boxes of my meager belongings up the creaking front stairs. The realtor had mentioned the attic was full of character. What she didn't mention was the door. It was at the end of the second-floor hallway, taller than the others, made of dark, unvarnished oak. No knob, just a tarnished iron latch. The key the lawyer gave me fit stiffly. When I turned it, the lock released with a groan like a stone grinding over bone. The door swung inward slowly, revealing steep, narrow stairs vanishing into gloom. A wave of cold air rushed out, carrying the sharp, acrid scent of oil paint and turpentine, utterly alien in the dust-thick stillness of the rest of the house. I flicked on the bare bulb dangling from the rafters. Weak light spilled over stacks of steamer trunks, draped sheet-covered furniture, and mountains of yellowed newspapers. And there, on the east wall, covered by a heavy canvas drop-cloth, was the portrait. I didn't touch it, not that first day. I just stood at the top of the stairs, the cold seeping through my sweater, listening to the silence. It wasn't empty silence. It was watchful. That night, I woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of scratching, not mice, deliberate, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging slowly down wood. It came from above, from the attic. I lay frozen, listening until dawn painted the ceiling pale gray. The scratching stopped exactly as the first light touched the window. The next afternoon, curiosity overpowered caution. I climbed the attic stairs, the cold deepening with each step. I stood before the draped portrait, heart pounding. It's just a painting, I told myself. Aunt Eleanor's odd taste. I gripped the edge of the canvas. Cloth. It felt unnaturally heavy, damp with cold. I yanked it down. The frame was ornate, tarnished silver. The painting itself was arresting. A woman in a high-collared Edwardian gown, seated in a carved wooden chair. Late 20s, maybe. Dark hair pulled severely back, eyes wide set, intelligent, but holding a sadness that seemed to bleed through the varnish. Her lips were pressed in a neutral line. The background was a blurred landscape of willow trees weeping into a twilight lake. The artist's signature was smudged in the corner. A. Thorne, 1898 Os. I studied it for 10 minutes, noting the meticulous brushstrokes, the lifelike sheen on the woman's skin. Nothing unusual, just an old portrait. I recovered it with the drop cloth. The smell of turpentine sharpened my nostrils, and went downstairs. I woke the next night to the scratching again, but this time, beneath it, a sound that stopped my breath. A low, muffled sob. Not human, not animal. A vibration in the air, itself, like wood weeping. I didn't go upstairs. I locked my bedroom door and pressed my ear to the floorboards until dawn. In the morning, I climbed back to the attic. The drop cloth lay crumpled on the floor. The portrait was uncovered. I stared. The woman's expression had changed. Her lips were no longer neutral. They curved upward at the corners, a faint, almost imperceptible smile, but her eyes, they were wider, brighter, and filled with a quiet, unnerving hunger. I backed down the stairs, cold sweat on my neck. Impossible. Must have knocked the cloth off last time. Trick of the light. But the turpentine smell was stronger now, clinging to my clothes. The changes escalated. Night after night, I'd find the drop cloth discarded, the portrait uncovered, its expression shifting with the moon. Tuesday, tears like liquid pearls tracing paths down her cheeks, her mouth open in a silent wail. Wednesday, eyes narrowed in suspicion, head tilted as if listening. Thursday, a full, radiant smile that didn't touch her cold, black pupils. Friday, lips drawn back in a snarl, revealing just the hint of sharp, yellowed teeth. Each time, The turpentine scent grew thicker, sharper, until it coated my tongue. Each time, the cold in the attic deepened, frosting the dust on the trunks. I tried recovering it. I pinned the drop cloth down with thumbtacks. I wedged a chair under the attic door handle. Nothing worked. Every morning, the cloth was on the floor. The chair was back in the corner. The portrait was uncovered. Watching, waiting, I researched. The town library's local history section held a brittle newspaper clipping from October 3rd, 1898. Local artist Alastair Thorne commits suicide after wife's mysterious disappearance. The article was brief. Thorne, a respected portraitist, had reported his wife, Clara, missing after she failed to return from a walk along Willowwood Lake. Weeks later, Thorne was found in his studio, wrists slit, surrounded by half-finished portraits of Clara, all showing her with expressions of terror. The police suspected foul play but found no body. The case went cold. The house, Willowwood, was sold. Clara Thorne. The name echoed in the silent house. I stared at the portrait's latest change. Last night, her hand had lifted from her lap. One pale finger pointed directly at the attic stairs. That night, the scratching stopped. Instead, I heard singing. A woman's voice, clear and sweet as a bell, drifting down the hallway. It was an old lullaby my mother used to sing. "Hush now, baby. Don't say a word. Papa's gonna buy you a mockingbird." But the words were twisted, slowed, the melody souring into something mournful and wrong. I pressed my palms over my ears, but the voice wasn't outside. It was inside my head. Cold seeped under my bedroom door, pooling around my feet like water. The singing grew louder, closer. Then, abruptly, silence. I found the message at dawn, scrawled in what looked like dried mud on my bathroom mirror. "Let me out." She didn't jump. Panic became my constant companion. I stopped sleeping. I taped the attic door shut. I bought sage and burned it until my eyes watered, chanting prayers I didn't believe in. The house absorbed it all. The cold spots multiplied. Drawers opened by themselves. The lullaby hummed in the walls. And every morning the attic door was unlocked, the tape torn cleanly aside, the portrait uncovered, Clara's expression now one of desperate pleading, tears streaking the dusty varnish. Her pointing finger wasn't aimed at the stairs anymore. It pointed straight at me. I called the lawyer. He refused to speak of Clara Thorne. "Burn the portrait," he hissed down the phone, his voice tight with fear. "Burn it and scatter the ashes in the lake. Don't look back." When I asked why he hadn't done it himself, he went silent for a long moment. "I tried," he whispered, 20 years ago. The fire wouldn't take. The frame turned black, but the canvas, it stayed clean. And after the knocking started in my walls, I moved 3 times. It always finds me. I gave you the house to save myself. Forgive me." He hung up. That night, the power died. Not just in the house, in the whole street. Moonlight bled through my window, painting the room in shades of bone. The singing started again, louder now, coming from the hallway, not the lullaby. A new song, a dirge. Heavy footsteps climbed the stairs, slow, deliberate, too heavy for a woman. Thud, 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 stopping outside my door. The knob rattled, not violently, patiently, testing. I backed into the corner, clutching a fireplace poker, tears freezing on my cheeks. The cold radiating from under the door was arctic. The singing shifted, Clara's voice now layered with another, a man's voice, guttural, furious. "Mine," it growled beneath her melody. always mine. The lake took one, but the house keeps the other. Come out, little bird. Let Papa see you. The door handle turned. The lock held, for now. But the wood around it began to splinter. Fine cracks spiderwebbed across the surface. Moonlight caught the edge of a shadow beneath the door, a man's boot, polished and black, resting on the threshold. The singing swelled. Clara's voice now a scream inside my skull. He didn't let me jump. He pushed. He painted me while I screamed. I ran, not to the front door. The shadow was there too, tall and broad-shouldered, blocking the exit. I ran up to the attic. It was the only door not yet breached. I threw the latch open, stumbling up the icy stairs, slamming the door behind me. I jammed the spare key into the lock, twisting it hard. Below, the splintering stopped. The singing ceased. An unnatural silence fell. I stood in the attic's freezing dark, breathing hard. Moonlight streamed through the dormer window, illuminating the uncovered portrait. Clara's face was transformed. No sorrow, no fear, pure, radiant fury. Her eyes blazed like coals. Her mouth was open in a silent roar, and her hand wasn't pointing anymore. Both arms were outstretched, palms upturned, as if pushing against an invisible barrier. The turpentine smell was suffocating. Paint fumes stung my eyes. Then I saw it. Behind her, in the painted willow trees, the background had changed. No longer a lake, a dark, churning hole in the earth, ringed with grasping skeletal hands, and standing at its edge, half fused with the shadows, was a man in a painter's smock. Alistair Thorne. His face was a rictus of rage, one hand gripping Clara's wrist in the painting, the other holding a palette knife, dripping in black paint. But his eyes, they weren't fixed on Clara. They were staring out of the canvas, staring directly at me. The attic door shuddered, not from the latch, from the inside. Something heavy slammed against it once, twice. Wood cracked. Moonlight caught the edge of a black boot pressing through the splintered gap. Clara's painted eyes flicked toward the door. Her expression shifted again, not fear, but resolve. She turned fully toward the breach, her outstretched hands now aimed at the intruder. The turpentine smell turned acrid, burning. The air crackled. Frost spread rapidly across the floorboards toward the door, crawling up the splintering wood. I understood then. She wasn't trapped in the portrait. She was trapped guarding it, keeping him contained. The scratches, the sobs, the changing expressions, they weren't hauntings. They were battles. Every night Alistair fought to break free. Every night Clara held him back. But she was weakening, and my grief, my loneliness after my mother's death, my raw, open sorrow when I first moved in, had been a feast for him. He'd smelled it like blood and water. He'd been using me to erode her hold. The lullaby wasn't just Clara's voice. It was his lure, mimicking the comfort I craved, drawing me closer to the door he needed me to open. The door exploded inward. Alistair stood in the frame, not a ghost, but a thing of shadow and dried paint. His form flickered, peeling like old wallpaper, revealing glimpses of bone and river silt beneath. His eyes were pits of darkness. In his hand, the palette knife gleamed. He didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on Clara's portrait, on the hole in the painted earth. "Mine," he rasped, the sound like gravel in a tin can. "Time to come home, my sweet." He stepped forward. Clara's painted form rippled. Her outstretched hands glowed with a faint, silvery light. Frost shot from her fingertips, encasing Alistair's boots in ice. He snarled, shaking it off, advancing. The temperature plummeted. My breath fogged thickly. The painting surface began to bubble, the varnish cracking like ice on a pond. I didn't think. I ran not away, but toward the portrait, toward Clara. I pressed my palms flat against the cold canvas, right over her heart. "I'm sorry," I sobbed, the words ripped from me. "I'm so sorry for your pain. I'm sorry I let him use mine. You don't have to hold him alone anymore. Let go. Let go." A shock wave of cold tore through me, not painful, cleansing. Clara's painted eyes met mine. For a heartbeat, I saw not pigment and canvas, but a woman, real, terrified, unbearably sad. Then her expression softened, not into peace, into release. She lowered her hands. Alistair roared, lunging for the painting. But Clara stepped out of the frame, not as a ghost, as a ripple of moonlight and frost. She flowed between Alistair and the portrait, her form shimmering, insubstantial, yet radiating fierce warmth. She didn't fight him. She embraced him, her arms wrapped around his shadowy form. He struggled, snarling, the palette knife plunging into her light, but it passed through, harmless. "No more, Alistair," her voice whispered, not in my ears, but in my bones. "No more pain, no more painting the dark." They began to dissolve, not fading, unmaking. Alistair's rage turned to confusion, then a childlike sob as the shadows peeled away, revealing the broken man beneath. Clara's light grew brighter, warmer, pulling him into its glow. The hole in the painted landscape sealed itself, replaced by the willow trees and the calm, moonlit lake. The turpentine smell vanished, replaced by the scent of dew on grass. As they faded, Clara turned her head toward me. One last look, not sadness, gratitude. Then, with a sound like a sigh through willow branches, they were gone. Silence. The attic was just an attic again. Dusty, cold, but naturally so. Dawn light seeped through the dormer window, illuminating the portrait on the east wall. It showed Clara Thorne seated calmly in her chair. Her expression was serene, peaceful. Her hands rested gently in her lap. The background was a perfect, undisturbed lake at twilight. The signature in the corner was clear now. Clara Thorne, 1901. I took the portrait down, not to destroy it, to hang it in the sunniest room in the house, the morning room overlooking the garden. I cleaned the glass, polished the frame. Every day I sit with my coffee beneath it, watching the light shift across Clara's face. She never changes now. She just is, calm, present. The house is quiet, truly quiet. The cold spots are gone, the scratching, the singing, the feeling of being watched. They vanished. But sometimes, on still evenings when the willows sway by the lake, I catch a scent on the breeze, not turpentine, wild roses. And if I listen very closely, beneath the wind and the leaves, I hear two voices, not singing, just breathing, together. I leave the attic door unlocked now, but I never go up there. Some doors, I've learned, are best left closed, and some portraits aren't meant to be kept in the dark. Clara earned her peace. I won't disturb it, but on the hardest days, when grief for my mother feels like a stone in my chest, I still press my palm to the glass of her portrait. Warmth always blooms beneath my fingers, and in the quiet, I swear I feel the faintest pressure against my hand, like a thank you, like a promise. You're not alone. The house holds its breath. The willows whisper. And for the first time since I arrived, I believe it.